Commissioner. Okay, folks, well, I think we're ready to get started.
All right. Is this on? Great. Welcome back to the FCC, members of the CSRIC. We're here today to hear final reports from the CSRIC working groups and close what's been a very successful CSRIC 3. I'm Zach Katz. I'm the Chief of Staff here at the FCC. And I'm here to welcome you on behalf of Chairman Janikowski, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but who asked me to welcome you and also to read a note that he has sent to Glenn Post, the chair of CSRIC 3, which I'll get to in 1 minute. So this iteration of CSRIC was chartered just about 2 years ago, March 2011. It's completing its term this month, and we appreciate the flexibility of folks in light of the snowstorm we experienced last week in rescheduling and being here today. It's been absolutely world-class work that you all have done over the last 2 years. Industry leaders representing a broad cross-section of the communication space, engineers who literally help develop the internet, who understand the latest technologies, academics, federal, state, and local partners. We're just thrilled with the caliber of the folks we've been able to attract. And that really starts with Glenn Post, CEO of CenturyLink, who spent a lot of time over the last couple of years leading this group. I'll read a short note from the chairman here. Glenn, thank you for your tremendous service. Your tenure as chairman of the CSRIC has been filled with accomplishments spanning a broad range of topics, from 911 to emergency alerts to cybersecurity. I want to draw particular attention to two areas. CSRIC's work to shepherd the development and application of a test bed for indoor 911 location accuracy was creative and effective and should result in quicker solutions to this difficult but important public safety issue. Also, your groundbreaking work on core internet security helped move the ball forward on some of the most intractable cybersecurity issues we face. I wish you all the best. Sincerely, Chairman Janikowski. I'd just like to add to that a deep thank you to Stacey Hartman of CenturyLink, who was steering committee chair and at the staff level is responsible for so much of the success. We know it was a big commitment to get this done over the last couple of years. We asked a lot of the CSRIC over the last 2 years, and the CSRIC really delivered. The chairman mentioned 911 location accuracy. I'll add to that next generation 911, the cybersecurity work, coming up with these critical recommendations on the anti-bot code of conduct, border gateway, protocol security, DNSSEC. These recommendations, more than just theoretical, we know that broadband providers serving more than 92% of American subscribers have agreed to implement them. It moves the ball in very meaningful ways at a time when we're grappling with these issues across government. For your service to the country and for the benefit of all the consumers that you're helping, the businesses as well, I want to thank you. I also would be remiss not to thank the outstanding FCC staff, Jeff Goldthorpe here at the end of the table, Lauren Kravitz, the designated federal officer and deputy federal officer, who have full-time jobs to do and nevertheless find time to ensure that this process continues and produces the great results it's produced. So thank you again for your service, and with that, I'll introduce Commissioner Pai.
Well, thank you, Zach. I can't really improve on what Zach said and what the chairman said in their messages. I'm simply here as a comedic relief, so they've given me 5 minutes. And I do want to say that I had a lot of material prepared for last week. I was really ready to go, and then we got the major snowstorm, as you know, something that we in Kansas call weather, and I wasn't able to deliver my remarks. But I do want to say simply, to build upon what Zach said, thank you. It is remarkable what you've been able to accomplish under the current charter, and although your mission is wrapping up in its current iteration, I think it's truly impressive, the body of work that you have and will compile today. I especially want to thank the many members from across the communications industry who have participated in CSRIC's work. It's really amazing, from CenturyLink to Amazon, from NAB to Newstar, from Iridium to the New York City Department of Information Technology and Telecommunications. We really have benefited here at the FCC from the rich variety of perspectives that you have brought to the question of security, reliability, and interoperability. And so for that, I know I speak for my colleagues here at the Commission when I say we are deeply appreciative and we're grateful. I also want to echo what Zach said in thanking the members of the FCC staff, Jeff, Lauren, and others who have helped shepherd this process along from the agency perspective over the last several years. We value their input as well, and we're grateful for everything they do in all manner of public safety issues. I just want to make a special mention of Next Generation 911. That's something that we've been working on quite a bit. Congress told us to report back to them on recommendations on how to think about advancing the ball with respect to next generation public safety networks. We reported to Congress recently. We are going to be voting on this coming week, as you probably know, and draft notice of proposed rulemaking that will take some of the things that we've learned from the CSRIC, in particular some of the best practices that you've recommended over the years, and try to apply them in a way that's going to ensure that when the next real emergency strikes, unlike the last snowstorm, we'll be in a position where every American will be able to have a secure, reliable, and interoperable public safety network at his or her disposal. So I don't want to belabor my welcome any longer than I have. I just want to reiterate once again, thank you. And if in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead we can ever be of assistance on these issues, please do let us know. So thank you for your service.
Thank you, Zach. Commissioner Pye, appreciate your kind words and your support for the CSRIC and continual service that you provide the Commission and really our country. Thank you very much. To begin, I'm going to ask Jeff Goldthorpe to provide some opening remarks. Jeff?
Yeah, just to officially convene the meeting. First time doing this since I started doing NRIC in 2002, I think, that I've said welcome to the NRIC or the CSRIC meeting in the afternoon. Good afternoon. We've never said that before. We've never had a meeting that starts in the afternoon. They always start at 9 o'clock. It's already been suggested to me once today that maybe we should always start them by Lauren. So when we roll around to the next CSRIC, that's a question we should throw out there. Welcome to D.C. Last year when we did this, the cherry blossoms were out, I think, and they will be out again soon. That happens every year. We have all but one working group making a final report today. So it's a busy agenda, but we will, I believe, move through it quickly. Most of the folks, or not most, but at least a good number, maybe even half of the folks that will participate today from the council are on the bridge, just because of scheduling issues. So we'll have to go around and make sure we've got a good count of who all is here. But once again, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all that you've done to make this such a success. I'm very proud of all that's been done in this council. So with that, I'll just turn it back over to Glenn.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate your leadership. Past 2 years since I've been here, it's been outstanding. And just want to say I'm glad everyone survived here in Washington. The blizzard last week had slowed things down here, and glad we could reconvene today. As I was preparing for the meeting today, I realized that nearly 2 years have passed since the Commission recharted CSRIC and Chairman Janikowski appointed me to chair this council. Time has gone by quickly, but I hope you'll agree that the work and volume of issues we've dealt with are impressive, and I sincerely appreciate the focus and dedication of this team in working cooperatively to develop and improve policies that will make our country and citizens safer. There's been an amazing amount of work done here by this group, and especially these team leads. You're to be recognized and appreciated for what you've done. During our first council meeting, we discussed the important public safety and homeland security related communications matters that we were charged with accomplishing. This included making recommendations on the reliability and security of communication systems and infrastructure, emergency alerting, and 911, enhanced 911 and next generation 911 services. Shortly after the work began, we were also asked to explore ways to expedite the delivery of 911 calls to public safety answering points during times of high call volume and for next generation 911. And then in August 2012, the Council was asked to examine and develop recommendations about technical cybersecurity controls that could provide the most effective mitigation of known cyber risk. In order to accomplish these challenging assignments, the working groups literally hit the ground running. In the time that we have assembled, our working groups have first, they've assessed the overall readiness of the 911 system for accepting information generated by next-generation 911 applications. We have identified next-generation 911 technical standards, gaps, and interface requirements. We have reviewed and provided recommendations on disaster and network security best practices. We have evaluated alerting issues associated with common alerting protocol, migration, and identified CAP implementation issues at the state and local levels. We have outlined outdoor and indoor location accuracy and testing criteria. We have developed voluntary initiatives related to domain name system security extensions, implementation practices, secure routing implementation practices, and published the U.S. Anti-Bot Code of Conduct for Internet Service Providers. So there's obviously been an amazing amount of work done by this CSRIC group, and I want to thank you again. Today, the working group will expand this list of accomplishments to include reports on next-generation alerting, E911 location accuracy, network security best practices, domain name system security extensions implementation, secure routing protocols, botnet remediation, E911 best practices, common alerting protocol migration, 911 prioritization, and consensus cybersecurity controls. And this is just a high-level snapshot of the amazing work that's been accomplished during CSRIC 3, but it is also proof that the communications industry continues to recognize the importance of public safety and homeland security-related communications, and that we are dedicated to ensuring that communication systems remain secure and reliable. Before we move to the next agenda item, I'd like for all of the working group leaders to stand, please, so we can recognize you for the enormous amount of work that you perform. Working group leaders, please stand. These folks carry a big load of the work's done here at CSRIC, and I sincerely appreciate those who are here and those who aren't able to be here today as well. They really do an amazing amount of work. Yes, David Turetsky is planning to be here. He is testifying today in Congress, so he is not here yet. Hopefully he'll make it later. So when he gets here, we'll ask him if he would like to speak to the group. But we appreciate David's legacy of work here as well. He's done an outstanding job. But this time we'll move into the working group final report presentations. If we've... Pardon?
We have to do a roll call.
Okay. Jeff just reminds me we have to have a roll call here, so we'll take care of the roll call. Where is the... Do we have a roll here?
Yes. Let's just do this, go around and have folks identify themselves, and then just identify themselves.
Okay. We'll just go around each person, identify yourself. We'll go around the room, please.
I'm Ajit. I work at the FCC.
Thank you.
This is Christian Vogler. I'm from Gallaudet University.
Brian Oliger, WTOP Radio.
Wayne Pacey, Federal Reserve Board.
Lynn Plotty, National Association of Broadcasters.
Damon Penn, DHS and FEMA.
Jean-Paul Imard, Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions.
Doug Davis of Hypercube.
Timothy Lorello, substitute for Maurice Tozay, Telecommunications Systems.
Brad Ramsey, substituting for Maureen Harris, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners.
Bill McGinnis, substituting for Rod Rasmussen, Internet Identity.
Kevin Green, filling in for Stu Elby, Verizon Communications.
Kelly O'Keefe here for Donna Bethea Murphy of Iridium Satellites.
Bill Smith, PayPal.
Rao Vasreddy, representing TIA.
Mike Mosier, T-Mobile.
Tony Bogovic, filling in for Brent Green, ACS.
Brian Doan, DHS.
Craig Donaldson, Intrado.
Mark Sox filling in for Alan Powler, Sands Institute.
And Ed Amoroso, AT&T.
Great. Okay. Thank you. I'm Glenn Post, chairman of the of this CSRIC Council, and I'm also would like to ask the folks on the phone if you could. I know this is going to be difficult, but hopefully we can ask you to identify yourself without. We will try not to work over each other too much, but if we could, we have a lot of folks on the phone this morning. I know. If you could identify yourselves, and we'll tell you what. Let me. We've got a list here. Let me just go down the list. That may be a better way to do this. Bill Buckholz, are you on? Bill?
This is Brett Schneider filling in for Mr. Buckholz.
Okay, Brett, thank you. Jack Doan? Jack? Jack Doan? Laurie Flaherty?
This is Laurie. I'm on the bridge.
Hey, Laurie.
Hi.
Jennifer Hightower?
Hi, this is Jennifer Hightower. I'm on the bridge.
Thank you, Jennifer. Christopher Homer?
Christopher Homer's here.
Oh, Christopher. Rodney Jeff?
Rodney Jeff is here.
Brett Kilburn? Brett Kilburn? Alyssa Kim? Alyssa Kim? Danny McPherson?
This is Danny. I'm on the bridge.
Okay. Michael O'Riordan?
Michael O'Riordan is on the bridge.
Oh, Michael. Jacqueline Randall?
This is Danny. I'm on the bridge.
Okay. Robert Ross? Robert Ross? William Sagal?
This is William Sagal. I'm on the bridge.
Dr. Dorothy Spears Dean?
This is Dorothy. I'm on the bridge.
Daniel Traynor?
I'm here.
John Wick? John Wick? Steve Wisely?
Steve Wisely's here.
And Karen Wong?
Karen Wong's here.
Hello, Karen.
This is Donna Dodson from NIST. I'm also on the bridge. I was planning to be there in person and could not make it today.
Okay, Donna, thank you. Anyone else? Anyone
This
else
is
on the bridge?
Andy Ellis from Akamai. I'm also here, but my name was skipped.
Okay.
Jose Luis Rodriguez from HITN. I'm also on the bridge.
Thank you.
And this is
Scott
Richard.
Tollefson. This is Scott Tollefson. I'm on the steering committee with Damon Penn for Working Group 2, also on the bridge.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Glenn. This is Robin Howard, Working Group 8. I am on the bridge.
Thank you, Les.
This is Richard Shockey with the SIP Forum. I'm on the bridge as well.
Okay.
This is John Thomas with Sprint. I'm filling in for Bob Ozzie.
Okay, John. Anyone else on the bridge? Okay. Well, thank you very much for responding to the roll call. And now we'll move into our working group final report presentations. Jeff, is that okay with you? As we've done during the previous council meetings, we'll vote on each report after it is presented so that everyone is aware, due to the scheduling constraints today, the order of the working group reports have been adjusted slightly. We'll begin with Working Group 7, the botnet remediation, with Peter Fonash and Mike O'Riordan.
Hi there. It's Mike O'Riordan speaking. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you, Mike.
Okay. Well, Working Group 7 had a set of objectives. So if we can go to the first slide. And the idea was initially to review the international codes of practice, come out with an agreed-upon set of voluntary principles, and then to develop some potential implementation obstacles and identify performance metrics. We had a very comprehensive membership, if you go to slide 2, ranging from industry associations, ISPs, vendors, academics. It was very gratifying. We had a great deal of help, and I want to give a great deal of thanks to the people that participated, because there was a lot of work. So, slide 3. 2012, we delivered the ABCs for ISPs, the code to which now 94% of the ISPs represented in the US subscribe, in terms of residential subscribers. Once that report was delivered, we then went on to consider barriers to ISP participation. And we identified 5 sets of barriers. Technology barriers, where we've got issues around the technology to tackle the bot threat. Consumer and market barriers, where we're looking really at the barriers that the customers see as being ineffective. Operational barriers that could negatively impact an organization's mission and resources. Financial barriers, the actual cost of putting in place the code. And finally, any legal barriers that were identified. As part of our final deliverable, we've come out with a guide to those barriers, and I'm not going to go through it in detail, but it's a pretty comprehensive guide to the way in which ISPs can look and address these barriers and potentially overcome them. More challenging, I believe, has been the concept of dealing with metrics. And we have come out with a guide to bot metrics. What we have not come out with, and I have to be absolutely candid, is a metric. So we've gone through this metrics guide, and we have an expected audience. We've talked about what is not a bot. What things do we count? Questions on the statistics. The use of ISPs as a potential source of botnet data. And looked at issues like sinkholing and come out with a number of recommendations. So finally, we also came out with a glossary to begin an attempt to define some of the terminology that's used, and a guide to the kind of work that's going on elsewhere, because it's not just in the United States that it's going on. It's going on in Japan, Australia, in Germany, now Turkey, Spain, Denmark, a variety of places. And also, we also came out with some sort of appendix which covered what else, other work's going on in industry. So the work that's going on, for example, at Morgue, the work that's being promoted by institutions such as Shadow Server and Spamhaus. So in conclusion, we delivered the anti-bot code. We delivered a guide to potential barriers. We identified steps that the FCC can take to help to overcome those barriers. Identified challenges around obtaining effectiveness of metrics. And what's important is this code, as well as the barriers and metrics guide, is going to require periodic updates. We have to be absolutely sure that there's a need to address the problem on a multi-stakeholder basis. This isn't just an ISP problem, it's just not an OS operating system vendor problem, it's everybody's problem. And I think we need to continue to focus on both bot reduction and mitigation to reduce the spread of bot infections. So our recommendations in finality are that the FCC, working both in partnership with other federal agencies as well as the industry, should facilitate ISP awareness of the code barriers guide and encourage ISPs to use the guide as a resource in planning and evaluating code participation. Facilitate creation of case studies on bot mitigation efforts to examine metrics created around particular bot remediation efforts. A good example of which is the recent Georgia Tech DNS changer study, which was presented at Morgue in February in San Francisco, and which is available on the Morgue website. To leverage industry-sponsored pilot programs to examine the collection and sharing of metrics around particular bot efforts. To facilitate research in bot metric development, I think this is very important. And establish a vehicle such as a workshop or a webcast to foster ongoing dialogue around these issues and to include international participants. We believe that, Working Group 7 believes that the voluntary approach recommended is going to lead to further recommendations on the Internet ecosystem multi-stakeholder approach to best contain the spread of bots. And that by taking expeditious action on the recommendations, the FCC will significantly contribute to and facilitate development of voluntary practices that can be followed by the Internet ecosystem multi-stakeholders to combat the spread of BOS infections. So I recommend this report to the Council.
Good. Thank you. Mike, any discussion, any questions for Mike on the botnet remediation? Anyone on the phone have any questions or comments?
William Sagal, Major County Sheriffs, would just like to pass along my appreciation for a outstanding effort.
Thank you, and I agree with that. It's been we've made progress here, and botnet, no question about it. And it is a very serious issue, as we all recognize. Anyone
Thank
else? Any other comments or questions? Okay, we'll call a vote. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Anyone opposed? All right. Motion unanimously carries. And thank you, Working Group 7, very much for the work you've done in this area. Next, we'll be Working Group 2 on net generation alerting with Damon Penn and Scott Tollefson.
We'll start
Yep.
with Scott.
Good morning. This is Scott Tollefson. I hope you can hear me okay. Damon and I are going to split our presentation. We have our slides. Thank you. Working Group 2 was responsible for making recommendations on actions that the FCC should take to promote development of next-generation alerting systems. For our purpose, alerting includes addressing members of the public who are affected or are expected to be affected by some crisis or emergency, whether naturally occurring, like a wildfire, or man-made, like a terrorist attack, and whether the emergency is an anticipated event, like a hurricane or a severe winter storm, or a sudden event, like an industrial accident or an earthquake. Alerting, for our purposes, includes transmitting messages that are advance warnings of approaching threats, notice of a crisis that occurs without warning, and ongoing updates as an emergency situation continues. Also, alerting includes providing instructions on how to prepare for the specific threat in order to avoid or reduce risk of personal injury or property damage, and on how to respond to a threat by seeking safety or services provided by first responders. This slide shows our charter, which directed us to examine a wide range of considerations relating to the design and operation of alerting systems. A summary of the chief elements of this charter appears on the next slide, which is this one. Our approach was this. Given how alerting has evolved, and given how technologies and information management tools are advancing, what might be done in the future to get alerts to more people who need them in any given case? How can the most useful information be provided to those people as what is known about an emergency situation changes and as events themselves progress? And how can these vital communications be provided faster and with the highest degree of reliability? Next slide, please. Could we have the next slide?
Yes.
Thank you. We started by identifying the categories of players that could have interests and roles in providing effective alerts. And these are government and non-governmental alerting system operators, providers of distribution platforms. Whoops, if you could go back one, please. Thanks. Manufacturers of receiving devices and applications developers, various types of content providers, and organizations representing persons with special access or functional needs for receiving alerts. Next slide, please. So we energetically recruited members from these constituencies in order to both inform our work and to ensure that our recommendations would arise from a diverse collection of perspectives. These are the organizations that have participated in one way or another. We have a list of our working group members at the end of our presentation. Next slide, please. We established 3 committees to focus on separate portions of our charter. These committees are the architectures and platforms. They cover the architectures and platforms to be used for alerting systems, the technical and operational criteria for delivering alerts, and the many dimensions of social media alerting. The committees started by analyzing the early operation of both the emergency alert system and the commercial mobile alert service that the Commission recently renamed Wireless Emergency Alerts. We identified issues and concerns with these systems that might be addressed by next-generation resources and practices. We examined the process by which alerts are prepared, authorized, and transmitted to the public, and developed an alert activity chain, a diagram which illustrated common system elements and provided standard terminology. We reviewed the pertinent legislative and regulatory framework that affects alerting. We identified areas in which standards bodies currently provide significant value in the design and operation of alerting systems, and areas where further standards work would be beneficial. Most importantly, we studied the needs and the reactions of the public to alerts and warnings, based on factors such as what communications infrastructure is available and whether the user has access for functional needs or doesn't use English as a first language. We saw that the public wants and expects more timely information than it receives today. People want to know how emergency events are developing over time. They want to get information quickly from trusted sources if possible, or from amateur sources that appear reliable. And they want to contribute information from the scene of an emergency to help others. We also recognize the presence of competing values or interests in formulating our recommendations. 3 prime examples are these. First, the trade-off between the speed of communications versus the accuracy of the information communicated. Second, the question of voluntary participation versus mandatory inclusion in transmitting or receiving alerts. And third, the balancing of privacy interests against the monitoring of users' locations to enable geo-targeting of alerts. These issues arose repeatedly in our considerations, and resolution of these trade-offs was not always clear, nor is the issue of who might pay for the advances in next-generation alerting that may be possible. As the Council knows, communications infrastructure and applications are advancing rapidly, so the subjects of our analysis were not static. Our report is 80 pages long. Recommendations appear throughout the document, with the major ones presented in the executive summary and in a 5-page section at the conclusion of the report. We don't have time this morning to list all the recommendations, but here is the selection. Damon?
Yeah, for those following along, we're on slide 7. First, based on this research and experience, the group affirmed that the unique value of the Common Alert Protocol, or CAP, in providing for interoperability and sharing of information in connection with alerting. We recommended that the FCC continue to encourage the adoption of CAP data format for all alerting technologies while facilitating the format's continued evolution to accommodate emerging needs for stakeholders. In the future, the CAP protocol should allow the alerting originator to specify certain dissemination channels for a given alert in order to target the appropriate audience. And we believe the FCC should continue to work with the Federal Emergency Management Agency by various means to encourage all states, locals, tribal, and territorial governments to urge equipment vendors to use CAP. The FCC should work with Congress to seek funding and implement a sustained emergency alerting architecture and to support improvements in that architecture. Next, as alerts come to be originated by sources other than government emergency managers, some type of authorization and monitoring of originators would be beneficial. FCC should encourage aggregation of disseminators of alerts to conduct CAP specification compliance and CAP profile conformance assessments on new equipment intended for use in alerting and recommended by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Next slide, please. Regarding the development of new equipment, we believe the FCC should encourage manufacturers to integrate multiple alert technology into devices to improve their reliability in receiving alerts. We recommend that the FCC encourage vendors of origination systems to add decision support and artificial intelligence technologies to their equipment so that certain fields of the CAP message would be populated automatically, thereby saving time and promoting accuracy. For example, alert origination could include downwind prediction models, and alerts could be generating in areas towards which a hazard is predicted to travel. Equipment could also generate alerts in multiple media, so that, for example, if a text alert does not include an audio file, the equipment could generate one using text-to-speech technology. FCC should continue to promote research and development of technologies that convert emergency text messaging into multimedia messaging, including, for example, sign language translation. Commission also should encourage the establishment of a program and a logo that would certify a public alerting application as being issued by an official trusted source. We anticipate that some promising next-generation alert technology may not be commercially viable without government funding for research and development or other financial subsidies that would aid development. So the FCC should encourage Congress to provide such funding in appropriate cases through FEMA grants and other means. Next, the working group recommends that the FCC help develop a strategic plan for identifying and deploying new alert dissemination technologies, such as broadband alerts. The Commission could also assist in reducing or removing legal and regulatory impediments to deploying new technologies. Regarding assistance to access and functional needs community, we recommend that the Commission separately evaluate each group and subgroup within that overall community in order to assess the impact of proposed developments on persons with different needs. Next, please. Regarding use of social media and alerting, currently many government emergency response organizations maintain a presence or a page on social media sites. In addition, social media providers are developing their own new services for alerting, and the use of these sites by the public is growing. Given those trends, we believe that the FCC should encourage the development of standardized training programs about social media and alerting for emergency managers. We recommend that the Commission produce a strategic vision for information technology and Internet-based tools that would support social media alerting. We also recommend that, in concert with the Internet service providers and social media providers, that the FCC examine the feasibility and policy issuing relating to geo-targeting alerts carried by social media. FCC should also encourage the development of techniques for handling crowdsourced information, be it accurate or inaccurate, that is uploaded through social media services. As part of performing its duties under the Federal Warning Alert and Response Act of 2006, also known as the WARN Act, FCC created a Commercial Mobile Service Alert Advisory Committee to provide advice on structuring the commercial mobile alert system. Significant changes in wireless communication have occurred since that committee provided its report to the Commission. Examples include the widespread use of smartphones and continuing migration of traffic onto 4G network capacity. Given the impact of those changes, we believe the FCC should revive the advisory committee or create a new one to provide advice on future systems and a vision on wireless emergency alerts and take the trends of these systems into account. The Commission should also explore regulations or legislation that would address concerns about legal liability related to delivering broadband alerts to limit the potential impediment to implementation. Next slide, please. We recommend that the FCC stress the importance of sustaining all existing alerts and warning platforms. The public continues to rely on a wide variety of communication technologies for reasons of familiarity, availability, and cost. Users of legacy technologies should not be excluded from receiving valuable alert information. In fact, new alerting capabilities should be incorporated into existing communication systems as much as possible. And finally, the FCC should prioritize collaboration with other government agencies and non-government organizations in research and discussion of next-generation alerting issues, protocols, and technology. We also recommend the Commission continue to seek dialogue with private enterprise that are developing new generation alerting resources. Scott?
Thank you, Damon. Next slide, please. And this is the first of two slides listing the persons who participated materially in our work. Members of our group remarked frequently that with communications infrastructure evolving rapidly and social media services continuing to grow in importance, the FCC would benefit by continuing to pursue aspects of our charter after the CSRIC ends. Next slide, please. This is the second slide listing our members. We are pleased, of course, that the FCC has announced the rechartering of CSRIC for 2 more years and has indicated that the duties of the Council may include further work in the area of enhancing the ability of the public to receive timely and accurate emergency alerts and warnings. Damon and I would like to note for the CSRIC the names of several of our members who contributed very substantial efforts to this project: Ron Boyer, Anne-Marie Cedarberg, and Hisham Kassam, and also Crystal Turner, who provided very valuable administrative support for us throughout the project. And so, speaking on behalf of Damon and for the members of the working group, we hope that you will vote to accept this report and deliver it to the Commission. We would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions for Scott and Damon at this time? Any comments in the room here? How about on the phone? Any comments, questions from those of you on the bridge? Well, Scott and Damon, thank you for this report and the work you've done here. And at this time, we'll call for a vote. All in favor of adopting the recommendations of Working Group 2, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Any opposed, say nay. Okay. Passes unanimously. Thank you very much for this report, and we'll move on now. First, David Tereski has joined us here. David is the Bureau Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. We're glad to have David with us, and we're going to ask him to say a few words for us. David, thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. I know you've been well welcomed and also well thanked. I can forgo the welcoming, but I can't forgo the thanking, because we really owe a great debt of gratitude to you as an FCC and as a nation for the contributions that you've made of your time, of your expertise, and the results that you've produced during the CSRIC. It's been nothing short of spectacular, and a lot of committees don't end up with the kind of results that this one has. And so really, I want to say on behalf of myself, on behalf of the staff of the Bureau, and on behalf of the FCC, thank you so much. Glenn, thank you very much for your leadership. Stacy Hartman as well. All of you for your service. The work products have been the highest caliber. I was late today because I was testifying before Congress, and I was testifying about some of the very subjects that you have been working so hard to advance. And I was able to do what I had to do because in part of the contributions that you've made in making advancements in so many areas. I'm going to apologize in advance because I've got to go over to the White House for a cybersecurity meeting. But I want to also say that as this CSRIC comes to an end, another will begin. There's additional work. There's work that follows on what we've done, what you've all done. There's work that is going to address some other questions. The process, the papers that outline, I think, the process and timing for nominations, I think, have been circulated, and we welcome your ideas and help in forming a CSRIC 4 that will try to build upon the really great achievements that you all have made as part of CSRIC 3. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you for your leadership as well and the participation and support of this group. We appreciate that very much, and I just want to thank you for your support. One of the key concerns that I had going into this role as chairman was that what we did here was going to be impactful, was going to be accepted and utilized, and I think that's really happened, and partly because of the support you've provided us here. So thank you.
I want to thank the staff of the Bureau, especially the two people sitting on either side of me, Lauren and Jeff, for all of their hard work and that of their teams as well.
I agree. They've done a great job. Thank you. All right. We'll move forward to Working Group 3, the E911 location accuracy with Richard Craig and Steve Wisely. Richard or Steve? Or?
Thanks. So we We had two deliverables in this meeting. One was a report on the impact of CLBS and for use in 911, and the other one was a readout on our testbed effort on indoor accuracy. And I'm pleased to say that we managed to accomplish both of those by February of this year. Which I'm trying to look at which deck we've got up here. Steve, I think we're starting with the CLBS deck, so we agreed to divide and conquer on this subject. And let's let Steve go ahead, and then I'll jump in. So, Steve, you want to cover that one, and then I'll cover the test bed?
I certainly can, Richard. Thank you very much. We've skipped over the first slide, which is the opening slide. You will recall that the challenge of Work Group 3 was in three areas of focus, and we have now been able to complete the third of the deliverables, and we go to the next slide. Before we describe our mission here at the LBS, I just want to thank Ryan Jensen from T-Mobile and Wayne Ballantyne from Motorola Mobility. These two individuals led this challenging subgroup, and they really are one to be commended on that. The description of this particular work group was to explore and make the recommendations on the methodologies for leveraging commercial location-based services for 911 determination. And I think that as you read down in the description of the mission, we were able to do that. If we can go to the next slide. We've listed here 31 members of the work group who actively participated in this endeavor of ours, and you'll note that they run the gamut of public safety in the private sector. All 31 were actively participating in this over the course of roughly 12 months. And could we go to the next slide? We want to talk about the leveraging of the LBS, or location-based services, if you will. This final report does cover the location technologies that are now used only for location-based services, but which may very well be adaptable for indoor E911 location. It also addresses emerging location technologies that could possibly be used for indoor E911. The report, as it goes, those that have seen it already, will address for each of the technologies and provide an assessment on the accuracy and the time to fixed, or TTFF, if you will. It will also look at the location yield, the network impact, the handset impact, any standards implications, and also database creation and maintenance issues for each one of these topics. This report, for those that may not have seen it, runs 67 pages and is pretty comprehensive, and certainly this afternoon we don't have time to go in depth. If we could go to the next slide. The location technologies that the work group analyzed had to do with Wi-Fi based location, metropolitan beacons, OTDOA for LTE, RF fingerprinting, low Earth orbit satellite based positioning, the world of distributed antenna systems, DAS, if you will, positioning, assisted GNSS, hybrid positioning using multiple locations and inertial navigation sensors. And these were the technologies that we were able to find and deal with and address, and fairly comprehensive, as I've mentioned, when you get to read the report. One of the things that I'll lead into a little bit with this report, and Rich is going to highlight and report on specifically, is the role of the test bed that many people have heard about and that we talked about that will be coming up. And Only technologies that participated in the test bed had detailed parametric accuracy, yield, and TTF claims shown in this leveraging LBS report. And there were 3 of those, and you'll be hearing more about the technologies built in the next report. If we could just turn to the next slide, please. To come with literally a very brief summary, the diversity of location technologies review in this report really confirms that continual advances are being made in the field. Additionally, we believe that all technologies discussed lend themselves to hybridization. For example, the blending of measurements from multiple technologies that will increase yield and possibly accuracy. The group found, however, that very few location technologies are currently available for E911 indoor use. 3 location technologies participated in the indoor testbed. Based on the results, the work group believes that good progress is being made in addressing the indoor location challenge. However, I think that significantly more work needs to be done, including the characterization of additional technologies in what we hope to be a phase 2 of a testbed. We would recommend that the establishment of a subsequent testbed provide trials to evaluate future technologies such as Wi-Fi, GLO, NASS, the UTDOA, and OTDOA for LTE. We strongly recommend that the continuance of a testbed, as you'll hear shortly. The last slide that we have up, if we could just turn to that, talks about the fairly intensive work effort that this particular subgroup of Working Group 3, we had a kickoff meeting in March of last year, and we had a total of 5 face-to-face meetings throughout the United States. The group met, and the telephone conversations and conference calls were just very, very inclusive, and went on virtually weekly. That's our fairly abbreviated report for the leveraging LBS and emerging location technologies. And open for questions.
Questions? I see Richard. Are you finished? Are you complete? Are you finished with your report?
I'm going to do the second one on.
Okay.
All right. So, as you've already heard, in order to really try to answer the FCC's questions in this particular charter, we felt the need for a test bed was in order, and we went about trying to set that up back in September. And I have to tell you, I was trying to think on the train up here, what this experience felt like to me, and it's a little bit like playing electronic solitaire, where you're going along and you're thinking to yourself, man, this is not going to go well. This is not going to go well. I don't know if I'm going to get to the end. And all of a sudden you sort of reveal that one card, and the rest of the cards shoot up and complete the game, and you get to celebrate. All the way along, I have to tell you, I was a little skeptical of whether we were going to be able to get this done, but we managed to pull it off, and I think it was an excellent effort. And I will tell you also that I read these 2 reports in the last couple of days, I think for the first time personally, back to back without hesitation. In the work group, you're doing a lot of fragmented work, and I was really impressed with the quality and the comprehensiveness of the information that's in there. So I would encourage anybody who's a stakeholder in the industry around 911, if you really want to get a good sense for what's happening and what the technology is capable of, and what some of the challenges are, I would ask you to read the reports. I think I read the one on LBS on the train on the way up in about an hour and a half. So, it's a pretty good read. Okay. Now, we had a pretty good group of people that worked on this project. And, I think one of the keys to the success, and you've heard this over and over again, I think, is not only the commitment of the people, but the depth of experience that they brought to the challenge and their willingness to sort of put personal agendas aside and work as a group to try to produce something that we felt would be valuable and in fact, answer the FCC's questions. All right, so I'm going to jump down to slide 5, if you could. So again, the goal here was for us to put together a testing methodology and a testing house that would in fact answer the questions the FCC asked of us. And we wanted to do it in such a way that we felt like the information would be representative to the national challenge associated with indoor accuracy and testing for 911. And so we chose the San Francisco Bay Area mainly because there was a representative sampling of the different morphologies we felt like needed to be tested, different building types, different construction material types, and within a reasonably sized geographic area, it gave us all the elements we felt we needed so that we could really have a comprehensive test and then be able to use the results to represent what you could expect to see throughout the rest of the nation. We opened the invitation for the test bed up to a variety of vendors in the space, and we had 7 vendors initially begin the process, and we were actually successful in accomplishing have 3 go through the test process. And I will tell you, in hindsight, again going back to the challenge, I think if we'd been successful, as much as I would have liked to seen it, at getting all seven initial entrants go through the process, I think we would have probably been challenged to complete the work in time. So a little bit of a mixed blessing there. But we did have NextNav, Polaris Wireless, and Qualcomm all have their technologies tested. We also had, really 4 major carriers participate pretty heavily: AT&T, Sprint, T-Mobile, and Verizon. And then finally, we used the services of a competent test house, Technicom, to actually complete the work. Jumping to the next slide. So again, so we went into an environment that we felt would represent the nation in terms of all of those things. But in terms of the test data, we really wanted to produce something that we felt would be above reproach, right? That would absolutely stand up as valid and credible information. And, when you get this many engineers in one room and start talking about technical challenges, there's always an opportunity to argue over some minor, issue. But I have to say that as a whole, I thought we accomplished the job of really putting together a data set that is above reproach, that we've really tried to think out and argue over all those little issues about, well, what if we do it this way? Are we going to get a good result? And I think we've come out the other end of it with a really solid document and data set. Jumping to the next slide, this is just a little bit of a graphic that talks about the various morphologies that we were able to test in San Francisco: dense urban, suburban, and rural. And as you can imagine, when it comes to 911 performance, each one of those presents different challenges. And then when you take the conversation indoors, it gets even a little bit more unique. Jumping to the next slide. So let me talk just kind of high level for the results. Again, I think if you want to talk about results, you really need to read the report. There's a lot of good supporting data in there about how we ran the test bed, what we learned in the process, and all the details necessary to fully understand and comprehensively answer the question. But from a high level, I will tell you, I don't think anybody that had their technology tested was necessarily surprised by the results. I think there was no major surprise. There's probably a few minor ones, and down on the margins went, oh, that was interesting that we got that result. I wouldn't have expected that. But by and large, I think everybody that was tested under the test bed felt like their technologies performed about as they expected them to perform in an indoors environment, given some of the RF challenges associated with that. For all the technologies went through the test bed, we were primarily looking at the XY coordinates on the horizontal, but for NextNav technology, we were actually also getting data on vertical. Jumping to the next slide, slide 9. Just again, high level. I think yield varied somewhat with the severity of the environment, but generally it came in pretty good. Time to first fix was not an issue, and uncertainty. If we validated anything, it was the idea that uncertainty is still a good measure of how a network is performing and should continue to be useful in this context. All right, I'm on slide 10 here. So this is, this graphic sort of gives me what I consider to be probably the two big takeaways from this review. And one of those is that we can't think about indoor accuracy and 911 performance the same way we think about outdoor accuracy. That's pretty clear. And even traditionally good performance in an outdoor environment, is not going to necessarily meet the unmitigated expectations of some folks in the industry. And what we mean by that, if you look at this little scattergram, and it may be a little hard to see, but the report gives more detail on it. When you're in a really dense urban environment and the building next door is 3 feet away, or you're sharing a wall with the next building, a couple of feet of accuracy or 10 feet of accuracy can mean now you're in a different building, right? Even though the fix was a good one by the way we measure it today, if the expectation was that you were going to be in that building next door, then it's not going to meet that expectation. So clearly there's an opportunity to talk more about that, and I'm going to get down to our set of recommendations at the end here, but still present some challenges in those dense urban environments. Okay, I'm on my final slide here, lessons and recommendations, and the first one, I guess, is that I absolutely see the benefit of having a properly funded test bed. We think the framework worked very well. We think the test methodology worked very well and stood up to scrutiny. We think the results were useful and will be useful to the FCC as they take a look at the data, and frankly, anyone who's interested in the industry. It is a model that I think could be repeated. We've given, in the report, we tried to write not only what we did, but we tried to provide a framework that could be repeated, including all of the structure that went into how we set it up and some ideas about how it could be done again, and some of the things, the pitfalls we would probably avoid if we had to do it again from scratch, so that anybody who might take on the challenge beyond this CSRIC would have that information available to them. But creating and maintaining some sort of a CSRIC type framework is absolutely, I think, the best way to get to the kind of information we're trying to get to here. And again, a key to the success, I think, with a lot of things contributed, but without a doubt the largest was the commitment and the experience of the people on the team. And it was a very well balanced. You had technology companies, you had PSAPs, you had carriers, and so I think the group of personalities in the room and the interest in the room really resulted in us getting to a result that everybody could go, yeah, that reflects reality. Some of the challenges I'll just hit on quickly. Project setup was really interesting because the CSRIC is not a legal entity, right? So we had to figure out a way to contract with the test house to actually somebody's got to do the work, and so there were some challenges around that. I think we overcame them, mainly by a lot of companies just going, oh, the hell with it. We're just, we're going to sign a contract and we're going to move in down the road and we're all going to try to jointly participate and jointly fund it. And so we managed to pull it off. But if you wanted to do it in a more intelligent way, there probably ought to be some mechanism to set that up formally and have a contracting entity and a way to fund it that doesn't completely require a bunch of folks volunteering to fund. I think one of the big lessons for us was we really had a lot of challenges with access to buildings. Not only finding the right buildings that we felt represented, the morphologies and building construction types and elevations and all of that we wanted, but then being able to negotiate with a landlord and convince them to let us come in and kind of we could take over your hallway for the day, or we've got our test equipment on a cart and so frankly I don't think we went into this with a hard date that we knew we had to deliver on, but if we did it again, we would try to back up that whole process for identifying the buildings and getting property owners committed very early on, because it's absolutely one of the largest challenges to trying to pull this off, and certainly is a reflection of what you could expect to occur if you required testing to occur nationwide on something like this. So again, the idea of having a representative sample in an area like the Bay Area where you're really testing all the different parameters in one spot is absolutely the way to do it. All right, and then finally, I guess. In summary, again, I thought the report does a really nice job of characterizing indoor performance and indoor testing challenges, and does a great job of helping us understand what technologies are out there. The ones that went through the test bed, certainly, we've got really good hard data on that. The one Steve referred to in the LBS report, we've got some ideas about what those new technologies perhaps can do for us and what some of the stuff that's just over the horizon can do for us. And so a lot of good information in both reports that I think work well together. And I think, existing technologies did pretty well on the testing. I think there's changes that are going on with existing technologies that are going to continue to improve on their performance. And then there's technologies that are either commercially viable today or just over the horizon that are also going to be promising as we head into the future. I think the key for us is to continue to look at the technologies and changes in the different environments, the different air interfaces, and the different approaches to it, and again use a test house like approach to getting those technologies evaluated, so we can all look at them and say, hey, this is what this thing is capable of, and this is what our expectations should be, and we can determine whether or not we can improve the situation around 911. Finally, I would say the Bay Area again was a if we had to do it again, I don't think anybody would in the group would say it wasn't the right place to do it. I think it worked very well for that, and I would encourage us if we do have a phase 2 of the test bed that we in fact try to use San Francisco as the area. And that concludes my report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard and Steve. Appreciate that report. Now we'll open up for discussion. Anybody in the room have questions, comments? Anyone on the bridge would like to comment? Have questions? Okay, we'll go to vote. All in favor of the E91 location accuracy recommendation proposal, say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right. Any opposed, say nay. All right. Motion carries. Thank you very much again, Richard and Steve. Our next working group is Working Group 4 on network security best practices. We have Tony Tauber and Rod Ramison. Tony and Rod.
So I'm Tony Tauber, and Rod couldn't make it today, so I'll present on behalf of both. We go to the first slide. Working Group 4 is chartered as network security best practices. Next slide, please. Taking a look at two services which really underlie the capabilities that are offered by the Internet today, the domain name system and then interdomain routing, both have been pretty sometimes vexing to try and improve the security of due to their distributed nature and the many stakeholders that are involved in them. So this is an effort to improve that while at the same time some considerations are being made to change the fundamental protocols in a way that will also improve security, but this is a look at improving security in advance of those changes or their widespread adoption. Next slide, please. So we had about 30 organizations represented from ranging from service providers and network operators, academia and government and IT consultants, like many of the groups here, worked together well and had a broad number of stakeholders, and which you can see on this next slide, a few of. Next up. So the deliverables for the group were a final report on DNS, which took place 6 months ago in September 2012, and then today is the final report on the BGP and interdomain routing security. And with that, I'll dive in. So next up, please. Key points for routing security, or I should say for routing, is that it's an environmental good. It's a distributed ecosystem, and unilateral action by somebody, participant in that ecosystem, doesn't necessarily entirely benefit them, and not necessarily immediately, but the greater number of participants that you get improves the situation for everyone. Also, the deployment details and scenarios can vary in terms of the type of network and size, and so the recommendations really should as well. Lastly, autonomy is really sacrosanct. In the interdomain routing realm, each network and its administration is separate and needs to operate according to its own policies. It's been a key feature of the operational internet. So our focus has been on the currently deployed equipment, hardware and software, and not focusing on the protocol extension work for routing security, which you'll hear about later for Working Group 6. So we touch on internet service provider operational practices and also operational practices on behalf of enterprises and other types of network operators. Then somewhat also on the less technical administrative practices that also relate to security of routing and number of resources. Just to talk briefly about some issues that we tried to address. One was the session level vulnerability of BGP, which is the exchange of actual routing information between two routers or two different networks, which can be prone to a number of different weaknesses. Then there's injection and propagation vulnerabilities, which involve the insertion of incorrect routing information and or propagation of that information beyond where it's supposed to go. So either incorrect information propagated or correct information propagated incorrectly is another big thing. And then there's other issues which involve unauthorized access to the routing infrastructure and other sorts of misconfigurations and malevolent or naive. Next slide. A key to approaching the recommendations was to acknowledge the number of deployment scenarios that we have. They vary according to topology in terms of whether a given network is a stub network or a transit network, whether it's essentially at the edge or is expected to have a number of networks sending traffic across it. They also vary as a function of scale. According to the number of BGP routers, the number of BGP sessions and interconnections with other networks, and the size of the operational staff and their capabilities and what they can reasonably accomplish. So our process was to not reinvent the wheel because there have been a lot written and a lot of developed current best practices. But taken together, the recommendations can be confusing and contradictory. So I think that's been a barrier to their wider adoption over the years. And so we tailored our advice based on these deployment scenarios that I talked about and tried to make it more tractable for people to figure out which of the recommendations might really fit them. We touched on a number of IATF documents. One's from ICANN in the numbering space. NIST has developed some really good white papers. The Internet Society and the SANS Institute for dealing with access, system-level access and authorization. All in all, over a dozen separate documents were referenced. So some of the highlights were to perform explicit filtering of BGP prefixes. This is the routing information that's passed between networks. Leverage the customer relationships because that really can make the problem tractable. There are existing workflows and procedures that are in place that make it a more manageable thing to manage at the customer edge between the internet service provider and their customers. Then protect against spoofed IP source addresses. While this isn't routing per se, it does follow the same topological concerns where at a certain network border you know what kind of what source IP addresses that you would expect in because you're also accepting routes for that address space. And the importance of this is that spoofed source IP addresses can be not only a vector to further attack and instability of routing protocols, but also of other internet services that can be used to spoof to take the identity of a victim in an attack, or they can be used randomized to exhaust resources on a target server or system, for instance. And then also use extra steps to lessen the impact of route leaks. Route leaks are things that we've seen from time to time where routing information's propagated beyond where it's intended, and this has caused misrouting or overloads of different types. It's a difficult problem, but certain different approaches can lessen the impact, which has, while it might not prevent them entirely, but it can keep an explosion of prefixes from overloading the memory of all the routers, so you can limit that, and you can also limit the AS paths that you might see across a certain interface, so that if you have a sense of what distant networks you would expect to route across an interface, you think you can make some reasonable guesses about the topology, so that there isn't a misrouting incident. And with that, I would like to submit the final report.
Thank you, Tony. Report. Any questions for Tony? Any comments in the room here for Tony? How about on the bridge? Any comments or questions for Tony regarding network security best practices?
I do. This is Rodney Jaffe. I do have one comment I wanted to make at this point. As some of the folks know, I had some health issues last year, and I was the initial chair of this working group. And I want to just call out and give enormous thanks to both Rod Rasmussen and Tony for stepping in at a very late point and doing an incredible job in the working group. So although they may not have started out being involved in the beginning, they've done a great job. And I think the success of this group is purely as a result of the two of them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodney. And this is really good work here with this group. I appreciate it very much. Any other comments, questions? If not, we will bring this to a vote. All in favor of adopting the recommendation resolution of the Network Security Best Practices Group, please say aye.
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 All right. Any opposed, say nay, please. Okay, it's like it passes unanimously. Thank you very much again, Tony and Rod, for all the work you've done. All right, next we have Working Group 6, Secure Routing Protocols. And for that we have Andy Olgilski and Jennifer Rexford.
Over here.
Okay. Good, Andy.
Good afternoon. I'm Andy Ogilski. Jennifer has had a prior obligation, and after the storms that could not come here. So next slide, please. The task posed to us was to address the security issues in Border Gateway Protocol, which is the fundamental protocol used to route packets on the internet. The point is that BGP, as designed, relies on trust among network operators. This trust has been violated a number of times, both accidentally and maliciously. And our task has been to attempt to recommend to the industry a framework for incremental adoption of security extensions to the BGP protocol. Next slide. We have been fortunate to assemble a very strong group of experts working for 18 months almost in the spirit of public service. This is a critically important topic because if you break the routing, everything else breaks down too. So group members favored diverse approaches to solution. very often in a spirited fashion, and healthy differences remain until hopefully the best solution wins in near future. So next slide, please. Just a drop of background for non-experts. Inter-domain routing is fundamental. That's the inter in the internet. The protocol itself is fairly simple. It's a gossip protocol. I tell you where I can route and it spreads. However, policies regarding a selection of routes are very complex, can interact in strange ways. This is both very good for business and bad for security. So next slide, please. So I want to make sure that we understand what is the scope of the work that our group has done, because there are many angles concerning securing the infrastructure protocols. The fundamental notion that we addressed is how to distinguish legitimate routes from bogus routes or fake routes. Legitimate here generally means, with some hand-waving, in agreement with the intent of the number resource holders. Now, this is fairly flaky, and this needs to be sharpened to say legitimate simply means consistent with published routing policy. And that's where the entire problem lies. We cannot route securely until we really know who is authorized to route what and when. So securing BGP deployment for us simply means adding to BGP or to its operation some mechanisms preventing propagation of routes with bogus attributes. And we will focus specifically on solutions which are sufficiently advanced in IETF standards. That prefers RPKI. However, there are very interesting proposals in early stages of deployment, practiced by Level 3, by VeriSign and by others, that were not fully addressed by this group, and will recommend to address it further. So next slide, please. The basic question should be, why do we bother? Because how common are the security incidents concerning BGP? I want to assert that sky is not falling. However, the incidents that we see are fairly unsettling from time to time. So in short, they are too common for comfort. I think that's the best way to state it. And secondly, incident detection is fairly imperfect today. Again, this is due to the reason that we do not have good ground truth, namely facts about who is authorized to route what and when and where. When it comes to counting the number of incidents, we have some estimates here in our report. I would say that regarding origin hijacking or route hijacking, as it's often called, there are maybe several significant incidents per month, presumably many more that are hard to distinguish without confirmation of resource owners. And there is a lot of incidents with incorrect routing paths that are described in the report. So next slide, please. In a nutshell, 4 recommendations. First, improve the mechanisms for keeping databases with number resource ownership and routing policies. Without it, we cannot really secure the protocol very well. 2, any new extension of BGP creates new dependencies among complex systems. They can break routing. So first and foremost, be careful and do no harm when deploying new extensions of routing protocols. So we recommend cautious staged deployment. 3, RPKI has its own problems. It opens new attack surfaces and means of abuse. We describe, and this has been done for the first time within this working group, in a paper led by Sharon Goldberg. We are finding new methods of attacking RPKI, and they are worth looking for. I would like to mention here actually that attacks on the security infrastructure are presumably a growing type of threat. Adi Shamir, of the SNRSA Security, at RSA Security Conference 2 weeks ago, stated that that, in his opinion, is a growing threat, namely subverting certificate authorities, creating fake certificates. So, and lastly, we need to measure things much better to argue which solution is good and which solution is not good, or whether a solution is needed at all. So next slide, please. And I'll just walk with one slide per each of the recommendations here. So first, needing ground truth. We really need to do work on improving databases of IP address resource holders and their routing policies. That's what's currently in Internet routing registries and the like. The point that I want to make, and that the group very strongly affirmed, was that security of inter-domain routing relies on accurate information who is authorized to route what, where, and when. And we go over a number of ideas how it can be done using cryptographic technologies, such as public key infrastructure. Next slide. So recommendation number 2. Be careful with RPKI, and by extension with any other system that's going to be used to automatically exclude somebody from routing. So first and foremost, just as Tony Tauber said, and I want to acknowledge that Tony also has been a member of our group and did quite a lot of very good work there. AS operators should retain autonomy in setting the routing policies, which here also includes how to use RPKI. Second, RPKI should be used as one of multiple ingredients used for detecting and perhaps rejecting suspicious routes. And last but most importantly, RPKI-based extensions of BGP were ideally thought of as a fully automatic method of rejecting invalid routes. We caution that maybe full automation without supervision is not something we want to take lightly. Next one, please. So, as I said, the RPKI is a complex system. It's supposed to interface with another complex system, the global inter-domain routing system. And that RPKI has one strange feature. It has gone to some lengths to obscure information about ownership of number resources. Actually, a participant in BGP can appear under various handles, not expressing their identity. So we recommend that every RPKI repository employs accurate and effective human contact information for all certificates and ROAs. 2, and we also recommend that databases concerning who owns which IP resources and number resources in general are properly synchronized with the RPKI repositories. That's something that's critical for security in our opinion. Next slide, please. 3, what risks we perceive exist in RPKI? I want to stress that RPKI has not been fully deployed. It's in very early stages. So it's based on theoretical analysis of what can be done to the protocol, which I think is the right approach when you talk about security of new things. So this working group found vulnerabilities to selective denial of service attacks, in particular by applying pressure on certificate authorities. It may be a state actor, it may be a legal law enforcement authority, but it may also be an extra-legal pressure group. Such things did happen in the past concerning PKI systems and DNSSEC and DNS, and we recommend that RPKI operators make available tools to detect erroneous changes and registrations, and that RPKI operators allow open access to the databases and permit dissemination of the data and derived results. This is to detect attempts to tamper or abuse the system to prevent some party from accessing the internet for illegal reasons. And last recommendation, next slide, please. We recommend to use metrics to track how BGP security evolves. So quantitative analysis can be done. There is a fair amount of research in academia tracking incidents in BGP. It's significantly more difficult without knowing the ground truth. But if new research tracks the deployment of RPKI and deviations from RPKI and security incidents involved with deployment of RPKI, that would be extremely valuable to everybody. So all the details can be found in our report. If you could go to the last slide, please. I would like to stress also that this is an incredibly rich subject. It's critically important because it touches on the fundamental thing in the Internet. It's routing between networks. And we recommend that there is a real need for further study, and I leave it with FCC and with Jeff and his group to decide what to do with it. There are new attack surfaces opened by systemic dependencies between RPKI and BGP and their effects on international enterprises and critical infrastructure networks. Simple things. If routes somewhere can be revoked in one country at routes to critical infrastructure in another country, what do we do with that, in short, right? 2, we really need to execute a systematic comparison of RPKI-based and DNSSEC-based solutions and approaches to BGP security. There is not enough work that's really widely disseminated at the moment. 3, so far only 2 attributes of BGP routes have been addressed from security standpoint, namely origin and AS path. That's for experts. There are many others, and they also critically influence route selection algorithm. And lastly, there are open issues that are being studied, but there are no, I think, definitive answers at the moment. How does performance of RPKI and how does performance of other BGP security solutions scales with the growth of the Internet? We all say nice things about aggregating routes and keeping the routing table small. It doesn't work, okay? When Internet, quote, Internet of Things, unquote, keeps growing, we may very well deal with routing tables on the size of millions, hundreds of millions networks that need to be routed. So I'll finish here and take any questions there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Any comments, questions for Andy here in the room?
I have a question.
Jeff has.
Andy, you've worked for 18 months, as you said, on this problem. Well, longer than that, I'm sure. And your recommendations suggest to me that, and this is similar to what we heard in March, is that the technologies that we're talking about here are technologies that are still young, and that that have to be introduced very tentatively, slowly. That there's a lot to be learned about them to make sure that more harm is not done than good in rolling them out. On the other hand, we heard from Working Group 4 that there's a lot that can be done by network operators today in the form of what I'll call more sort of best current practices, methods and procedures on a sort of an AS level, rather than creating a whole new infrastructure to deal with this problem. And I guess what I'm wondering, you hear sort of in the background talk, by the time we're done implementing BGP-SEC, and it will be expensive activity, maybe we'll be on to some new technology that will have solved this problem another way. And I guess my question to you is, do you think that we're better off focusing on more solutions that lie more in the form of best practices, or do you think we're better off now trying to push BGP-SEC further?
Hi, this is Donna Dodson from NIST, and the actual question at the end kind of trailed off for me. I was wondering if somebody might be willing to repeat it.
Yeah, Donna, this is Jeff Goldthorpe. Sorry, I think maybe the mic was a little bit far away.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so the question is, just to make it a little briefer, is Working Group 4 today reported out recommendations for best practices that autonomous system operators could use in their own environments to try and improve the security of the routing infrastructure. Working Group 6 has been working on a long-term fix for that problem that's been around, BGPSec in some form or another has been around for a while. It seems from what Andy was telling us that for us to be confident in deploying that technology with vigor, we're ways away from that. So should we focus more now on implementing the kinds of solutions that Working Group 4 talked about today, or should we focus more on a bigger solution like what Working Group 6 has worked on? That's my question.
Thank you, Jeff. So in short, should we stress work on improving best current practices or some flavor of BGPSec, not necessarily based on RPKI or DNSSEC? I believe both. Note that our first and strongest and actually unanimous recommendation coming from this group has been that timely, accurate, and complete records concerning ownership of IP addresses, AS numbers, and their routing policies is absolutely critical to securing BGP. This can be only improved. So even if RPKI or alternative solutions currently experimented with do not take root permanently, anything that we can do to improve internet routing registries and extend them to other attributes would be an enormous help. So I think that we are in complete agreement with what Group 4 recommended. Second, current generation of technologies, currently used in internet routing registries, is not uniformly strong in sense of authentication, authorization, and similar properties, and much that's been put into development of cryptographically strong security could be applied to improving internet routing registries much faster, I think. And they are more distributed, which is healthy. Part of it is my private opinion. Any other questions?
About anyone on the bridge? Any questions, comments from the bridge?
Jeff, to talk to you from the industry perspective for a second, BGP is pervasive, as has been stated before. It's part of every nook and cranny of the internet today. And it's unlikely that it's going to move away to some other newer supplementing protocol anytime soon, because there really isn't a roadmap for that sitting out there. There's experimental things and other things like that. But to give you an example of how long it's going to take, look at how long it's taking us to move from IPv4 today.
I would just add to this, look how long it took to evolve from DNS to DNSSEC, and it's not really fully deployed as of today. But I would like to stress that in securing BGP, there are two flavors of quote BGPSec unquote. Some extensions do not modify the basic BGP protocol. They add another infrastructure to assist BGP security. Some extensions do modify BGP protocol. So I think that they may evolve at different rate.
Any other questions, comments? Thank you, Andy and Jennifer. We'll call for a vote. All in favor of adopting Group 6's proposal here, please say aye.
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 Any opposed, please say nay.
Aye.
Good.
Aye.
Okay, I believe the motion carries unanimously. And we appreciate, again, the report there. And now we'll go into Working Group 8, E91 Best Practices with Robin Howard. Robin?
Okay, thank you, Glenn. Today I am pleased to present Working Group 8's final report, Part 2, to the CSRIC Council and provide this last update for the working group. So if I go to Slide 2, please. On Slide 2, we provide Working Group 8's charter that has guided us through the process.
Our working group previously provided our first final report in June 2012, and now we complete our work with the release of Final Report Part 2 on E911 best practices. Our work for this final report was completed by 2 sub-teams formed to address existing best practices and establish 2 new categories of non-industry best practices. Can I go to slide 3, please? Our first sub-team, which we referred to as Working Group 8-2, was tasked with the review of existing best practices and recommend ways to improve them, accounting for the passage of time, technology changes, operational factors, and identify any appropriate gaps. This sub-team was chaired by Mary Boyd of Intrado, and I'd like to take this time to thank her for her leadership throughout the long months this sub-team was active. She kept us all focused on the task at hand and kept our participation levels high throughout the process. Also on this slide, we present the active members of this sub-team who brought their expertise and passion for 911 issues to each meeting, which I truly appreciated. Next slide, please. Working Group 8-2 approached the review of over 1,000 existing best practices from 3 different viewpoints, which included a gap review as the work progressed. First, the team reviewed those best practices that had a direct and immediate impact on 911 reliability and resiliency. Second, the team addressed those best practices that were interrelated with public safety, where they concluded that the recently approved public safety implementer category, which was approved in our June 2012 Part 1 report, was appropriate. And third, there were a number of best practices that were not directly related to 911 reliability or public safety. However, if these were implemented, it was concluded that the 911 network would benefit as a downstream improvement. Next slide, please. Working Group 8-2 assessed the full set of 1,023 existing best practices and narrowed those down to 730 as the team workload. From this subset of best practices, the team developed 10 new proposed best practices. We identified 11 for deletion, recommended modifications to 186 best practices, and identified 77 best practices as having a potential downstream reliability impact. Next slide, please. Our second sub-team, which we referred to as Working Group 8-3, was tasked with creating 2 new categories of best practices, one for PSAPs and the other for 911 consumers. This sub-team was chaired by Paul Stopples from AT&T, representing Addis, and I've worked with Paul on other industry projects in the past several years related to E911 and find his passion and knowledge in 911 to be a key ingredient for the success of this chartered item. I'd like to thank Paul for his leadership on this sub-team and look forward to working with him on future projects. Also on this slide are listed the active team members that provided their expertise and pen on creating a great first set of PSAP and consumer best practices. Next slide, please. This sub-team developed the concept and framework needed to provide a starter set of best practices and ongoing guidance for these new categories. As you can see on this slide, the framework closely, but not exactly, follows the existing framework for industry best practices. Several modifications were needed to take into account unique challenges that PSAPs face, as well as the educational nature needed for consumers. We want to stress that the set of 183 new best practices being proposed today are not intended to be a complete set, but the beginning of a long and successful future as we have experienced with the industry best practices. Next slide, please. Working Group 8-3, besides establishing a recommended framework, also identified recommendations for web hosting of the new categories, which will be a key part of their ongoing success. The team developed a new set of 65 best practices related to consumer education for the proper use of 911 and 118 new best practices for PSAPs based on existing and new practices suggested by various federal government entities and public safety organizations. The team also concluded that these new categories would not necessarily require full CSRIC Council approval for every change or new best practice going forward, and have recommended alternatives in our final report. We determined that adequate expertise exists today that could create and edit best practices in these two categories for most edits so they can be published quickly for the good of public safety. This recommendation is also part of our final report, Part 2, today. We also concluded and recommended that it was important for a recognized government entity to publicly endorse our work, which would provide legitimacy to the best practices and establish their ongoing existence. Next slide, please. On this slide, there are 6 recommendations that are found in our final report. In addition to the recommendations made on the last few slides that we've just seen, we recommended that communication providers, public safety, PSAPs, and consumers evaluate and implement appropriate best practices. Recommend the 2 new categories of best practices be kept apart and unique from industry best practices, and recommend that public notices and or press releases should be issued to further support the 2 new categories of best practices. Next slide, please. Working Group 8 also identified 3 gaps that we could not adequately address during this charter. However, we would like future CSRIC councils to take these into consideration. These gaps were hosted services, cloud services, and text to E911 services. Next slide. On this slide, we identify the 8 council recommendations found in our final report that's being presented today. These are more detailed than the previous slides, and because of time constraints today and in sake of time, I will not go through each of these in detail, but again, they're here on the slide for you, and they're in our final report. Next slide, please. On this slide, I've listed the comments that we received regarding our final report. We appreciated the feedback, and the final report has been updated to reflect all of these suggestions. Let me see for a second. I should be on slide 12. I don't see slide 12 up, but we should be on 12. Thank you. So most of these were editorial comments. However, one in particular for page 15 provided an alternative for web hosting for the new categories of best practices. And again, we addressed each and every one of these concerns in the revised final report that's presented today. Can we go to slide 13, please? And to summarize Working Group 8's work during this CSRIC charter, we've completed 2 final reports. The first in June 2012, creating an E911 best practice disaster preparedness checklist. 19 new best practices on that final report, and we created the public safety best practice implementer category in June of 2012. In this final report today, we present 465 new, modified, or recommended for deletion best practices. Of the 465, 122 of those were identified as critical, 150 as highly important, and 105 as important best practices. 272 existing best practices were addressed, 65 new 911 consumer, and 118 new PSAP best practices were written, as well as 10 new industry best practices being introduced. And slide 14, please. And on the final slide, we present our conclusions from both of our final reports. This was a significant work effort by a highly dedicated group of experts in 911 public safety, reliability, and resiliency issues. It was my privilege to chair this working group and to have an opportunity to work with so many talented individuals at this level. I'd also like to thank the Council for their time today and the FCC for allowing me to chair this working group. I thank you, and at this point, Glenn, I'm complete, and I'll open up for any questions.
Thank you, Robin. Any questions in the room for Robin? We have one here.
My name is Christian Vogler, and I'm from Gallaudet University. It's a very nice report, and I do have several questions related to your report. The first is, from the perspectives of people with disabilities, for example, those who are deaf and hard of hearing, my comment relates to number 3-24, wherein you say the consumers should always be in touch with 911 directly, rather than depending on a friend or a family member. So, from the perspective of a person who is deaf or hard of hearing, this is not always so. Depending on the circumstances, for example, on a handheld carrier, if we do not have access to 911, then there are times when it may be faster to ask a friend for help in getting in touch with 911. So that's one bit of information. The second point, I do see a gap with respect to best practices related to 911, which is a very confusing part to 911 for people with disabilities. It is not always clear which is the best approach, which of these options. Do I call through a relay service, through video relay service, or is it better to just text 911? Which is going to be more effective? That question is not always clear. And so I believe that's an issue that would need to be addressed in the future.
Okay, and those are excellent points, and I appreciate that feedback. And again, one of the things that I did want to stress is that this was a starter set of best practices. That the intent for all best practices is to have that continued growth and opportunity to correct, make them better, put new things out there, and that's why we wanted to bring these into this realm, so that we always have that history and that we can take this valuable feedback, move it over into an organization that has a responsibility to manage these on a real-time basis and get these updated and address those types of concerns. And that's exactly what this process is intended to do.
Robin, this is Glenn. Do you have a process to get this comment, this recommendation in the records there so that it can be addressed in the future?
I tell you, I think, Glenn, I can work with Jeff and I can work with Stacy to make sure I have the right process. But I believe that we can key this up and add this onto our report and take care of it that way. So I wrote it down and I have it captured.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments in the room? Any questions from the bridge? If not, we'll move to a vote. And all in favor of adopting the Working Group 8's Best Practices 911 report, please say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Okay, any opposed, please say nay. Passes unanimously.
Aye.
Great, thank you very much. And we will move on to Working Group 9, CAP Migration, Ed Czarnecki and Chris Homer. By the way, before we start, I just want to, the question was raised if we were going to take a formal break. We won't take a formal break. I ask you to take your breaks, personal breaks as you see fit. We have a number of people who are trying to make flights this afternoon, so we're going to try to keep going with the reports. So if you need a break, please feel free to take that.
Great, thank you. And on behalf of Chris, who couldn't be here, we deeply appreciate the opportunity to present some of our findings. We recognize as Working Group number 9, we're pretty long in the batting order, so we'll make this succinct. Moving to the next slide. The overall goal of Working Group 9 was to provide recommendations and best practices to the FCC on integrating the Common Learning Protocol into the emergency alert system. Again, the attempt to fuse next-generation IP-based protocols into what is essentially a Cold War-era broadcast technology. Over the duration of our committee's reports, we've gone through four reports now, including this final one. The working group delved deeper into the topic, and quite frankly, the feeling at the end of the day was we've barely begun to scratch the surface of some of the implementation tasks ahead. We can skip ahead past the working group structure to the membership. The membership, the 28 members, represent a fairly diverse collection of individuals from a range of companies, every aspect of the broadcast, the emergency alert, and the telecommunications industry. By and large, very active, very involved membership, and I want to give thanks to every one of them for their involvement in this process, sticking with it till the conclusion. Next slide, the executive summary. Very briefly, the working group established that there is a need for common best practices across the board to help assist with the transition of EAS to CAP EAS. From alert originators through dissemination or aggregation dissemination through the EAS participants themselves, we identified a broad range of best practices that we'll give a bit of a summary look at. The report will contain, the full report contains much more detail than I'll be able to provide here. We researched a number of issue areas and formulated several recommendations to CSRIC for EAS participants intended to help facilitate their CAP integration. For example, we had a broad consensus that the government should undertake testing and, if necessary, further development of a national level alert streaming audio message capability. I'm skipping over some acronyms there, but the EAN, or the Emergency Action Notification, is the one required message for all EAS participants, every broadcast and cable system in the nation. That is a capability that we have broad consensus that should be supported in this new CAP EAS architecture. We also recommend that the FCC coordinate with the IPAWS program over at FEMA to ensure that proper conformity assessment support is provided in the event that a manufacturer requires a test or retest of the product. We'll get into a little more detail about that, but that's a very critical issue for both regulatory compliance as well as the overall functioning of the system. The working group further recommends that compliance testing incorporate both a future streaming audio requirement. Right now, this is a static-based, file-based capability. We recommend that compliance incorporate both testing of future streaming requirements as well as the current data interface to the IPAWS server. Finally, we strongly advise that while this CAP EAS system is deployed and for the foreseeable future, the legacy broadcast or primary entry point based emergency alert system remain in place as a required parallel system. The migration of CAP EAS should not sunset the existence of the broadcast EAS system. Chronology, I guess very briefly, you can see the breadth of time that has elapsed since the FCC first issued its second report and order on next generation EAS in May of 2007. Activity has exponentially increased through the present time, but the whole CAP EAS migration issue area has been years in the making. Going to the next slide. This is a brief summary of some of our findings, and quite frankly points to a need for further study, further research, whether by CSRIC and CSRIC 4 or by another body. There are a large number of issues ranging from the network architecture and the physical components of the CAP EAS network to the data, the format of the data used in these CAP messages. There's a great deal more research that's required. Let me look a little more deeply at some of our findings. Starting with national level or presidential level emergency alert messaging. Many individuals in the FCC and among EAS participants and industry associations expected the new CAP-based alert and warning capability to support EAN messaging. The IPAWS architecture design supporting a CAP EAN has yet to be tested, has not been rolled out. Specifications and requirements have not been issued, which is a bit problematic since the equipment to support this national EAS capability has already been deployed. So as CAP requirements evolve in the future, including a CAP EAN, including streaming, audio, and potentially other data requirements, and frankly as EAS equipment manufacturers offer improvements and enhancements to their own product sets. The working group discussed the potential for such changes to impact the FCC certification requirements surrounding such equipment, as well as the potential need for retesting of this equipment under related programs, such as the IPAWS Conformity Assessment Program. We also noted that there is a significant need to attempt to synchronize the messaging between the legacy broadcast-based EAS and this next-generation CAP-based EAS capability, especially if a presidential EAN message is inserted into the system. It gets to a number of issues, including duplicate detection. These devices may not be able to detect duplicate messages going over very different alerting systems, broadcast versus CAP EAS. Next slide. In terms of conformance testing, some specific recommendations. The working group feels that the FCC should provide additional clarification and guidance for the manufacturing community as to what product and specifically software modifications may necessitate a permissive change filing or conformity retest or recertification, or frankly no action required on the part of the manufacturer. The rules governing this new CAP EAS equipment was quite specific in terms of new equipment being fielded, but is, in many of our opinions, a bit ambiguous in terms of what needs to be done if there is a device change, or software change more specifically. To that end, the working group recommends that the FCC coordinate with FEMA IPAWS to ensure that the current testing center providing CAP 1.2 USA IPAWS profile message conformance testing be maintained for the foreseeable future. The working group also recommends that the conformity assessment process be extended to include the interface between these devices and the alert aggregator, that is IPAWS. The conformity testing process right now focuses on the message, but not the transport of that message to the device. The working group also identified a need for best practices to guide both emergency managers and the systems development community in the process of CAP EAS message origination. Importantly, particularly in the light of the circumstances of the last several weeks, the working group further identified a need for identifiable, common criteria for network and data security for CAP message origination, particularly where multimedia resources would be offered on third-party servers and systems. I believe it's something we've mentioned in prior reports, but if an alert message references multimedia resources or internet addresses on an unknown third-party server, that raises a whole series of challenges for the device and for the consumer of that data, in this case the broadcaster or the cable operator. The working group also, in that regard, identified a need for alert disseminators, EAS participants, to undertake internal or external security measures, minimally firewalls, in order to achieve overall network security. The working group benchmarked off of a white paper published by one of the manufacturers in 2011 and adopted several of their recommendations as what was identified as a defense in depth approach that all EAS participants should evaluate. The working group noted that the lack of specific guidance or recommendations on security from government and alert dissemination sources to have been a significant area of oversight. The working group feels it is critical that additional best practices and guidance be furnished to EAS participants from the FCC or another agency, as well as from industry sources, whether that's manufacturers or industry associations. Finally, we wanted to voice our deep gratitude for the National Weather Service in joining Working Group 9 later in the process. Their input was critical for several of our discussion areas and generated a number of very important recommendations for the usage of CAP EAS messaging and broadcast operations and cable operations. We recommend that because there is a unique problem within weather service messaging in regards to broadcast media and cable media, we're recommending that there be developed a method for originators to tag EAS message with additional data, a message ID or some similar parameter, to allow newer or upgradable equipment to have a means to uniquely identify the source message and effectively filter out, or better, filter out duplicate messages while not simultaneously creating problems for existing equipment. Duplicate detection was an issue we began delving into very energetically at the tail end of our deliberations, and I think that is a significant area of research to be moved forward. The next area of discussion with regarding the National Weather Service, and not necessarily to pick on them specifically, but they are the source of over 90% of all emergency alert messages in the U.S. Because of the particular format of the content of National Weather Service alert messages, we strongly recommend that the Weather Service publish guidance that can be used for text-to-speech generation to the extent that such guidance doesn't substantially conflict with existing standards and practices already adopted within text-to-speech engines. A review by the working group of sample Weather Service messages going through IPAWS, as well as through standard National Weather Service dissemination means, identified some issue areas between how the text was formatted, some unique character sets put into text-to-speech, into the National Weather Service messaging, as well as, quite frankly, the length of the messages that would present a very significant challenge for text-to-speech presentation or text-to-speech rendering for broadcast and cable media, as well as even text display for television and cable and IPTV systems. We recommend that a set of acceptance criteria for these messages be developed with the input of the broadcast and cable community, and that these criteria be met before National Weather Service messages are made available on the production IPAWS open system. In plain speak, that means that the working group is recommending that serious attention be paid to the format of these messages, the 90% of messages, before they begin appearing on the IPAWS system for EAS participant consumption. There is a strong feeling that these messages will not appear on screen or in audio in a manner that was intended by the originator. So, bottom line is the migration to CAP is very much still a work in progress. A tremendous amount of work has been done by federal agencies, state agencies, manufacturers, broadcast and cable operators. However, much work remains to be done to ensure the proper functioning of the next generation of EAS. This discussion points to the need for additional research and additional work, including under a CSRIC 4 if enabled, but not only on immediate issues like the ones we've been talking about to just make CAP EAS work today, but also take a look at the future of EAS. Where does EAS go in the future? Where does it need to go to be relevant in this interconnected environment? So that is a very brief summary of a very energetic working group. I did mention before, but I give thanks to all of our participants for their efforts. It was a unique experience, highly energetic. The only comparison I can bring is sometimes it felt more like a day out of the British Parliament than a working group session. But these are individuals that are very passionate about their craft, very passionate about the subject matter. And I think the recommendations will serve well if seriously considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Any questions in the room here for Ed? Comments?
Brian Oliger, WTOP Radio. In addition to commending this group on its work, just a couple of quick comments. Given the recent breaches of EAS security that we've all been painfully aware of, I was pleased to see that you did address that as an area that needs to be investigated further going forward. And also the fact that you mentioned that efforts have to be undertaken to synchronize the messaging between the current radio-based PEP system and the IP-based CAP system. Very much agree that that's an area that also needs further study, perhaps in another working group in the future. So thank you.
Thank you. Comments on the bridge, from the bridge? If none, we'll move to a vote. All in favor of adopting Working Group 9's report, please say aye.
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 Mr. Bipin Patel. Aye.
Any opposed, please say nay. Okay, report and the proposal carries, is passed. Thank you very much again, Ed and Chris. We'll now go to Working Group 10, 911 prioritization with Thera Bradshaw and Gina Green.
Good afternoon. I'm Gina Green. Thera wasn't able to make it today. We're going to go over Working Group 10's report rather briefly. We were tasked with looking into ways to ensure that 911 emergencies or disasters calls could reach public safety in the event of disasters, and determine or look into how to prioritize those calls if possible, how to coordinate those 911 priority calls with other priority services that we already have available, look into earlier generations of wireless networks, 3G as well as 4G and LTE, and consider NG911 as well. Working Group 10 came into this CSRIC a little late. We started just a year ago in March. There's only a dozen of us participating on the committee. Everybody on the committee did a fantastic job of providing contributions and working through all of the initial objectives and tasks and scope that we had. I'm going to skip. Yeah, we can. Kind of at a high level, we initially categorized different types of emergencies and disaster calls. We looked into public safety operational impacts and considerations, the reliability and resiliency within today's networks, and the congestion points and call flows within those networks. Technology advancements and impacts on long-term evolution, or LTE, and next-gen 911. Consumer education, and then the existing priority and notification services. The next slide I threw in there just briefly because it shows that pretty much at every point within the call path has the opportunity to provide congestion during an emergency event, either from the handset or device to the cell tower, from the tower to the mobile switching centers, from them to the selective routers, and from the selective routers to the PSAPs. And the group went through, and it's included in the report, each of those aspects during our discussions. Additionally, we kind of took the opportunity to classify disasters into unique aspects of disasters and emergencies and their impact on both wireline and wireless traffic. The classifications we did as widespread with major damage, which include advanced warnings such as hurricanes, major damage with minimal warnings such as earthquakes. We may have some indication there might happen, but not as much in others. A more focused event with major damage to minimal or no warnings, tornadoes, bridge collapses, derecos, railroad derailments. More focused events with no warning, terrorist attacks, mass shootings, and then very focused events with minor damage to no warning. So automobile accidents, building fires. We hated putting those into minor damage, but when you look at the other categories, they're less significant events than the ones before them. In considering the operational impacts and considerations within the public safety environment, public safety answering points staff is based on an average call volume formula that determines the number of call taker positions necessary to meet the average or normal demands of the service. And that's an individual PSAP kind of calculation. There are 6,500 plus PSAPs listed on the FCC registry. They additionally factor into those formulas the number of busy signals and abandoned call ratios that they have to help indicate, how to process and handle the calls when they come through. Individual PSAPs have a number of wireless providers, wireline providers, and VoIP providers, and not everybody has the same amount. So there's a set of national carriers, there's also a set of regional wireless carriers, and then you have over-the-top VoIP providers. So all the PSAPs uniquely and individually have a set of communication devices coming into them, which they now have to process and be able to handle. Emergency calls to 911 should have priority over non-emergency calls, but the PSAPs normally don't have adequate staff to answer the calls in a major disaster. It's important to recognize that in today's technology environments, the PSAP has a finite number of call taker positions, and depending on the scale and magnitude of the event, some of those calls just may go unanswered. To give you an idea of the classifications or within the 6,500 plus PSAPs within the country, there are categories kind of into large, medium, and small. This is based on a Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau report, white paper on Next Gen 911 cost study, a basis for public funding essentials to bringing a nationwide next generation 911 network to America's communication users and first responders. Big title. But within that, large PSAPs are defined as 50 or more call taker positions, which is only 1% of the number of PSAPs in the country. Minimum are 6 to 49 call taker positions, which is 19% of that community. Small PSAPs are 1 to 5 positions, with the average being 2, which is 80% of the PSAPs in the country. That means at any given point in time, they can only answer 2 simultaneous calls. So when you look at, most of them have an average of 7 wireless carriers that have trunked into them. They've got local exchange carriers, 1 or 2 or 3. They've got over-the-top providers, and everybody's trying to get their calls into our ultimate choke point, which is how many calls public safety can actually handle at one point in time. We also reviewed the prioritization and notification services we currently have available. I'm not going to get into them now because several of the working groups ahead of me have already gone over some of what these do. So you've got the Government Emergency Telecommunication Service, or GETS, Wireless Priority Service, WPS, National Security Emergency Preparedness, NSEP, Next Generation Network Provider Service, and GNPS, and Commercial Mobile Alert System, CMAS. And all of those are available within the network today. We additionally looked at 4G or LTE, which does have within it the ability to do some priority for 911. It's conceivable that prioritization for 911 on the networks could achieve to communicate a priority for 911 calls. A lot of those networks are in their early development stages. They're just now being rolled out nationally. A lot of carrier, and we're all at different points in that evolution. Right now, the final report notes that it would provide little to no value to prioritize 911 calls to the end if there weren't enough people to handle the calls when they got there. So kind of in summary, we examined the existing 911 infrastructure, both wireline and wireless. It concluded adding prioritization within those calls is difficult and offer limited value. And then with the call volume being constricted by the available trunk size and the number of 911 personnel to handle the calls. NG911 may allow more opportunities for 911 call prioritization. Again, the rollout of NG911 within the community has been slow to take effect. We've been working on it for years, but it may offer some additional relief there. As I just said, prioritization on 4G networks is a possibility, but not until we deal with the in factor about how many calls actually are going to get answered. And then if we factor into possibly being able to do prioritization through 4G, we have to take into consideration GETS and WPS that are already priority services for emergency preparedness personnel, and how do you prioritize consumer calls into those existing environments. So kind of overall, at this time, the group recommends that we don't do anything with prioritization. There are some possibilities moving forward, but again, until we have something that the public safety answering points can do, when 80% of them only have an average of 2 call takers, prioritizing the networks to get more calls on them when they're not all going to be answered, or maybe answered slowly, or maybe put in a queue. I think there's some other issues we need to deal with before we set priority to the networks. And again, I want to thank the entire working group, who was wonderful. And we had some challenges getting people on the calls. We had calls every other week. We did a lot of work by email, and everybody was very, very responsive. We got a lot of work done through the email system, and I just wanted to thank my entire working group, if they're listening.
Okay, thank you, Jeannie. Any comments, questions here in the room? I did have one. As far as timing, the next step where you can get to prioritization, is there any kind of time frame you think you're looking at where there's to be staffed, the technology will reach a point where this can take place, more automated?
So we kind of talked about, the next steps of that. I think education right at this point in time would be the best thing. But once the LTE networks are a little more stabilized, or actually even finally rolled out within the networks, and we have more handsets, it's kind of all handset based as well. You have to have the handsets for LTE out there, so the legacy handsets aren't going to grab the same priority on the new network. So I don't know that anything within the next 12 months would buy us anything, but looking at it in 24 months might be a possibility.
Good, thank you. Any questions from the bridge? Comments? Okay, if not, we'll bring to a vote. All in favor of adopting the report of Working Group 10, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, please say nay. Okay, all in favor. Thank you very much, Gina and the group. And all right, got more ayes coming in. Good. Okay, Working Group 11, Alan Poller and Marcus Sachs.
Thank you, Glenn. I enjoy that 10 or 15 second delay there on the webcast. So you get all those eyes that come in after you're done. I'm Mark Sachs, Verizon, one of the co-chairs. Let me say thank you to Alan. And before I start, Alan, anything you want to say up front, or I'll give you a microphone when I get done, because Alan always has some good things for us to say and listen to. Our working group was formed. We were like the last ones created. We stood up at literally the last CSRIC meeting. So the presentation I'm going to give you today is our in-progress briefing, and it's our final briefing. So it's all pulled together. If we can bring those slides up, please. Again, we were started back in September. I'm not going to read the slide to you, but essentially what we were asked to do was to take a look at the 20 security controls that have been developed by the federal government and industry working together back in 2009. Has gone through a number of iterations. I believe they're on their 4th version now that's just coming out this month. These controls are looking at the enterprise, and they're designed to deflect known attacks. So stuff we're currently seeing coming through the networks at enterprises, what can you do to stop that? The question was, are those 20 controls also applicable in the communication space? Can we take them and apply them to the way we run our networks? What we had to base this on was the previous CSRIC work, Working Group 2A back in CSRIC 2, Ed Amoroso's group and others who worked on that, developed 397 best practices. So when you have 20 controls and 397 best practices, of course, at first this is somewhat overwhelming. How do you bring these together? And that was the task of the group. Can we take these two lists, compare them together, and let's see what comes out of it? Do the 20 controls apply? Do we have some other things in the 397 that are new? And let's see where it goes through that. Again, we only had 6 months, and what we were asked to do at the end today was to put together a prioritized list. How do these controls work for us? So next slide, please. Participants, we had most of the carriers, of course, quite a few government officials working with us. There's one more slide there of participants. Number of people also from state governments. So a wide variety of folks that helped out. We conducted our meetings on Mondays at 3 p.m. We found a good time slot. It's amazing to do that, as you can imagine, to try and find 1 hour when everybody can dial in, and off we went. So in those 6 months, we broke it up into phases. The first thing we, of course, had to do is just get everybody smart on the 20 controls. And in our final report, there's a nice appendix that walks through what they're about, the history of them, how they got to be where they are today. I would encourage all of you to take a look at that. It's a good primer on that background. We had to ask the first question, though, going through each of them, if the comm sector took that control, whatever that control was, and applied it, in addition to deflecting a known attack, could it potentially cause damage? In other words, could we shut down something? Could we prevent a call from being completed? Could we knock out parts of the Internet, for example? And in large part, all 20 of them will work. That was the first cut. Yes, they all work. They all apply. And we found a few that if you apply them with rigor, yes, you could cause some potential problems. And that is explained in the report. Again, I'm not going to list through all these here, but it's worth taking a look at. We did not find any of the 20 that would not apply. So all 20 do apply. We then took a look at the CSRIC 2 Working Group 2A effort, essentially going through all 397 of them. And when that group did their work, it was not through the lens of what's a known attack and how do we stop the attack. It was really just a good body of knowledge about best practices. This is how we should run secure networks. So using the lens of known attacks and does a specific best practice stop a known attack, we were able to kind of shorten that list down to, and this is another appendix in the report, all of those best practices that actually do stop attacks. And in most of the cases, individual best practices did line up with one of the 20 controls. This was an absolutely amazing thing that we were able to see where two independent groups had more or less come to the same conclusion. Now, we found a few of the 397 that went beyond the controls. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And so there was a little bit of learning that we did as we went through this. Once we were done with that, of course, we started writing reports, and that's what we have today. So next slide. Essentially, the four things we did, again, I talked about that just a moment ago, was the 20 controls and how do they apply, and then looking for these gaps that are in there. So one of the lessons learned that came from this, one of these gaps, is we found that in one of the 20 controls, it's called training for security staff. Very well written control. The idea being is that we need to have the security staffs need to be absolutely smart about what's going on. However, the way that control is written is mostly focused on the users. General users of a system need to be educated. In our 397, where we talk about that, it's more focused on the security people themselves, the network operators, the sysadmins, and so forth. So there was an interesting little mismatch there. So the group that runs the 20 controls has now taken that input back, and they've updated that control to include the fact that we also need to do education for those who operate these networks, not just those who use the network. So that's one of these areas where we found that our previous work in CSRIC 2 can actually inform the work of the 20 controls. We also found that within the CSRIC best practices, there was a good deal of a good body of knowledge about denial of service attacks. Many of you are probably familiar with the problems we're having right now with the DDoS attacks against the financial services sector. So a 21st control, if you want to think of it that way, has emerged from this that addresses how to defend against this type of an attack methodology using what is currently being used against us for DDoSes. So we've proposed that of the 20, of course those all apply, but perhaps a 21st also applies to the communications sector. That more or less, you can go ahead and go to the last slide here, that more or less takes us where we are today. we believe that there's still a lot of rigor that needs to go into this. This was just a quick look, a 6-month project, high level. Let's just quickly go through the 20, quickly go through the 397. But in so doing, we realize that these results we've come up with also need to be independently vetted. We need to have other groups look at this and see if the conclusions we've reached are in fact correct. We think that, of course, the best practices, that body of knowledge that belongs to CSRIC, needs to be continuously updated as well. Just like everything else in this community, as the threats change, as the technologies change, the best practices need to continue to be updated. While we were working on this project, the executive order came out about a month ago. That was not anticipated. And in the executive order, there's the call for the development of the framework, the public-private partnership that will develop the cybersecurity framework. So the timing turns out to be quite well. This body of knowledge can now be used to inform that framework. And so we anticipate the Communications Sector Coordinating Council taking this work and working with NIST and others as the industries work together through the sectors to drive this framework of common cybersecurity best practices. This is going to be an excellent input, and we think that the Communications Sector Coordinating Council may be a good place to put this work for continued evolution and continued improvement. Last slide, again, because this was our first briefing and it's also our last briefing. We began in September. We conclude today. Alan, let me turn it over to you if you have any thoughts, comments.
No, I think what the group did was really quite remarkable, especially given the executive order searching for frameworks right now, not having any, and the work you sort of led at the end, bringing the industry together, all sides, to say this really does apply. There's more work to be done to make it, to tune it, but it really does apply in the context of the executive order is important, because you sort of said, put a stake in the ground and said, here's a framework. We can improve it, but we've got one. I also wanted to mention that we have with us Tony Sager. There's a frustration in the cybersecurity field that it's changing so fast that how can anything keep up? And in these critical controls that are the theme here, that question came up from MI5 in the UK and from other people who are adopting them. And Tony was the head of all the cybersecurity defenders at NSA. He was the chief operating officer at NSA for the defense. And he's taken on the job of making sure that every known threat is reflected in the 20 controls. So we have I think what this group has done is really taken cybersecurity a step forward, a really necessary step. The energy industry is doing the same thing, but it was really a necessary step to say, put a stake in the ground. We know what we need to do. Let's get on with it.
So, Glenn, subject to questions, that terminates our report. And I want to thank the working group in particular. Alan is co-chair. It was a quick 6 months, and I think a good body of knowledge has come out of that. So thanks to our working group for that.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that, and Alan as well. Any questions here in the room for Mark or Alan? Any questions, comments on the bridge? Okay, if not, we'll move to a vote. All in favor of adopting the Working Group 11 Cyber Business Controls report, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, please say nay. All right. All right. A lot of ayes coming in. Okay. Thank you very much. This report passes and adopted. Thank you again, Alan and Marcus. And now we have Working Group 5, DNSSEC. Steve Crocker. I think Steve's on the bridge with us.
Hello.
Hello, Steve.
Can you hear me well enough?
Yes, we can.
Good. And I'm signing into the... Nope, that didn't work because I misspelled it. All right, I'm on the web page as well.
Steve, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Oh, okay. I needed to click the button there.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you all very much. I apologize for not being able to be there, and appreciate the accommodation in terms of fitting this into the time. So I'm Steve Crocker, chair of Working Group 5 on DNSSEC implementation practices. Next slide. Let's see. How do I make this bigger so I can see it more easily? Hard to do. So I'm actually at a slight disadvantage here trying to read the slides and remind myself what we're doing on the screen here. Well, the focus of this working group is, as the title suggests, the implementation of the DNSSEC security extension to the domain name system within the family of internet service providers. And so just very briefly, the whole point of DNSSEC is to add cryptographic signatures to each and every entry of the domain name system in order to provide high quality assurance that the answers being sought are in fact the correct answers provided by the registries and haven't been tampered with in transit or in storage in intermediate so-called caching resolvers. DNSSEC was motivated by events that were demonstrated quite some time ago that it was possible to poison caches and hijack DNS queries, and so over a long period of time that protocol was developed and is in the process of being deployed. There are fundamentally two sides to the protocol. One is that every entry has to be signed, and on the other side, the lookups have to be checked. The signing process has been proceeding. The root was signed about 3 years ago, a little less than 3 years ago. The top-level domains, the major ones, are all signed. Arguably, China is one of the only major ones that isn't signed, and I expect that will be announced and have some sort of ceremony next month. And quite a few other top-level domains are also signed. Uptake down at the enterprise level is much slower, but proceeding nonetheless. On the validation side, that is actually checking the signatures when being looked up, is at a much earlier stage. A few ISPs, notably Telia in Sweden and Comcast in the U.S. and several others around the world, have taken a leading position, but it has not yet become standard practice. This working group was started to sort of examine the situation and frankly, to encourage the adoption. One of the things that we looked at early on and reported earlier was a distinction between having resolvers that do the validation so that the ISP's resolvers do the checking versus providing enough support so that an end user could retrieve the records and do his own checking. So to say that in a slightly different way, in order for an end user to be able to do his own checking, needs some degree of support from the recursive resolvers that he's retrieving records from. And some older resolvers do not provide the necessary support. This has to do with extended length records, so-called EDNS 0 option, has to do with whether or not the resolver is willing to process records of types that it might not know about, and so forth. So in the previous report that we gave, which was a full year ago now, we had come up with a grading system, A, B, C, and D, where A was assigned to validators, to recursive resolvers that did validation, we call them validators, B to resolvers that were supportive, provided all the support necessary so an end user could do it, and C and D were various versions that were below that level. There's been quite a bit of pushback on the notion of grading as a term, and we've tried to move away from that. But the recommendation that was made a year ago was to that ISP should come up at least to the level of being supportive of end-user validation, if not going the next step further and doing validation themselves. Probably time to move a slide forward here. So that's the objectives, and we then moved into the mode of saying, can we survey the population and understand how much adoption there has been, as well as trying to promote it. Next slide, please. So this is now cast in the form of a measurements effort, and I apologize. I should have an independent copy of these slides because I can't see the webcast properly. Give me just 1 second, and I will pull it up.
Steve, is there something on the slide that you want us to remind you of or read you?
Here we go.
Hey, Steve. I don't think it's on yet.
All right, I now have the slides on my machine. I can read them, but now I can't see which slide is being shown. But the measurement slide 3, actually it's the fourth slide 3 of 0 through 12. So we built a set of objective tests to be able to probe a resolver and determine what capabilities it had, and based upon that set of capabilities, give a description of it in terms of whether or not it meets all of the needs to do validation itself, or whether or not it meets the slightly lower requirements to be what we call a DNSSEC aware resolver, meaning that it supports end user validations, or the old C and D lumped together doesn't have enough functionality for various ways. Next slide, please. Measurements, edge cases. So we discovered in preliminary work that there are various unanticipated limitations, and we evolved the set of tests to check for these. One of the key areas is the support for large packets, either through extended through large packet EDNS0 over UDP, or via TCP. And we discovered in some cases one was provided but not the other, and in some cases neither. We also discovered that relatively more recent record types, specifically DNAME and NSEC3, and the ability to support unknown or new record types, which is actually part of the specification for the DNS protocol, were absent in various places. When we found those limitations, we assigned the description of partial validator, or equivalently partial DNSSEC aware resolver, and then added the descriptors for what those limitations were. Next slide. We engaged in 2 forms of surveying. We had in mind others, but the 2 that actually got completed were the following. One was we made use of the Sam Knows platform of devices that are several thousand are at end user sites and can be programmed. The company, Sam Knows, takes the tests that we designed, implemented those, and put those out on their end systems, and ran our tests probing the resolvers that those devices had access to. So what this slide shows, the Sam Knows results, was a pretty interesting set of results. The green, both light and dark, are the DNSSEC aware resolvers, and that comprised a full half of the resolvers that were found. Of those, 1/3 of them were not complete, but 2/3 of them were fully supportive of DNSSEC aware resolvers. And what that means is, from our perspective, is that full set, all half of those, were intending to be fully supportive of DNSSEC resolution by validation by end-use systems, and but 1/3 of them fell short in some ways. But there's a distinction in our minds between the intent to do it versus the execution, and presumably that would improve over time. The blue, both the light and the dark, are the ones that go a step further and are the validators. And remarkably, we have the same 1/3, 2/3 split of those, that 2/3 of the ones that were attempting to do validation succeeded completely, and 1/3 of them were deficient in one particular way or another. And then the remainder, the orange, white, and gray areas, are other matters that fall into the other category of not being supported. That's a much higher adoption rate than frankly, than I had expected. Next slide. We also initiated a survey, not from inside of individual networks, but from outside, if you will, from a vantage point, where we looked at virtually the entire IPv4 space, and sent probes to find out if what was at that address was a resolver, and then if it appeared to be a resolver, then ran those various tests. The numbers here, the first number is simply the number 2 to the 32nd minus 1, which is the total set of addresses IPv4 space. A small fraction of those we didn't probe because they are local addresses or otherwise on a sort of community list of don't go there, unassigned addresses and so forth. So the 3.4 billion number is the total set of addresses probed. There were experimental issues along the way. 10 million responses got dropped. We would recommend redoing the survey process. We probably overran our name server bandwidth. We got full responses from 26 million, and of those, 11.7 million were we'll call good responses, and then another 6 million of those were well-formed. I would have preferred to show you comparable results to what I showed you on the Sam Knows, and with a bit of apology that we didn't quite get there. Next slide. So the next slides are the details of how that experimental setup was arranged. I'm not sure that we want to spend the time, although I'm more than happy to answer questions if you want. We did find one interesting unanticipated result. Quite a few stub resolvers, not an overwhelming percentage, but nonetheless a substantial number of stub resolvers sitting at small businesses or homes, which are really there to answer queries from inside the home or inside of the small business. Turned out to also accept queries from arbitrary places on the net. So to say that again more compellingly, each of you has some connection to the net in your house, And as part of the what you think of as the modem, it's actually a router, and built into that router is actually a small DNS server. And that DNS server, in these cases, is accepting queries from outside the house and turning those around and trying to answer those. And a not uncommon practice in major ISPs is to limit what the big recursive resolver at the main service centers respond to only queries that are coming in from its customers, from the net, from its own network. And here we had a situation in which even if the main recursive resolvers were closed, so they only intended to serve their customers, there was kind of a backdoor open through these stub resolvers that would take queries in from anywhere in the world and then forward them to their to the ISP's resolvers. We don't have all of that data analyzed, and we want to be careful about disclosing that, but it was a illuminating picture that came from there. So the basic findings, this is slide 8, really the 9th slide. Many resolvers are DNSSEC aware. That's good news. And some of the resolvers actually go the next step and check the signatures, full validators. And our recommendations on the next slide, divided here into 2 parts. The top part of the slide repeats the recommendations from the report that we delivered to you a year ago, and then we've added to that the 2 recommendations in larger type below, that the survey and description process should continue with refinement and continued measurement. And it continues to be controversy about whether DNSSEC aggravates the DDoS problems, because name servers can give back longer results with DNSSEC than they would have without, and those play a role in amplified DDoS attacks. It's not a trivial subject. It doesn't have a simple answer one way or the other, and it's somewhat unfortunate because it brings into confrontation 2 different security-oriented goals. One is eliminating DDoS attacks, of course, and the other is protecting the DNS system. So, rather than try to give a definitive answer to that here, the appropriate recommendation here is that ought to be brought to light and dealt with in a very detailed and sound way. And the current state of dialogue is this is a problem, no, it isn't, back and forth kind of thing that probably isn't serving the community optimally. In the next slide, so we circulated these slides for comment. We got back just 1 comment from Lori Flaherty, which we greatly appreciated, and that we expand the set of acronyms, and we did that. And so the conclusion is that ISP support for DNSSEC is necessary, even in a future in which if you imagine that all the endpoints perform their own validation, and one wants to argue that it's not necessary for ISPs to do validation, it is nonetheless necessary that they bring the resolvers up to the level that it provides the support for the end users doing validation. That's the report. We've had really quite excellent interactions within the working group, and it's been a rewarding effort. Happy to answer any questions or engage in discussion or follow-up.
Thank you, Steve.
Steve, this is Andy Ellis from Akamai. I'm sure you're expecting this question, but I find it sort of interesting that we have major players in the space saying, giving very good technical reasons for how DNSSEC will cause DDoS for them. We have people asserting that's not a problem, rather than saying, well, how can we help fix that problem? it seems like we'll have a hard time moving forward on that recommendation to look in more deeply if people are closing eyes to established problems.
Yeah, the claim that DNSSEC is causing the problem is a little bit controversial in its own right, in that amplified DDoS attacks existed before DNSSEC, and the more subtle question is not that they enable amplified DDoS attacks, but apparently the claim is that they make them harder to counter, because in the earlier era you could use, say, a 4,000 byte text record as the response in an amplified DDoS attack. We're getting into pretty specific details here, so I don't know how much of our audience we're losing. But it was demonstrated many years ago that you could get much, much longer responses with just salting recursive resolvers with long text records, for example. And the rebuttal to that is, yes, but we know how to counter that because we could build filters very quickly, because those are strange-looking things and they wouldn't occur naturally. Whereas DNSSEC responses, we can't filter those as easily. I don't think we have sufficiently brought all of the parties together, looked at all the issues carefully, and I'm not comfortable with the idea that because it's, one or more of the operators are unhappy about DNSSEC causing making it more difficult for them to filter responses, that therefore DNSSEC is bad. But even more strongly than that, it won't do any good, even if you believe that DNSSEC is bad from a DDoS point of view. Operators' unwillingness to provide a level of support for DNSSEC won't stop the amplified DDoS attacks using DNSSEC, because there's already sufficient implementation of DNSSEC at the root level, at various top-level domains, so that it is not tied to what choices the ISPs are making with respect to whether they're willing to check signatures or willing to pass longer results. They still will get bombarded with responses that come from other places.
Well, I think the concern is on the part not of the client ISP operators, but on the operators of large DNS services that use dynamic capabilities there. Is there still some question as to whether there exists an exacerbation? Because if so, I'd like to talk to those people and show them some simple math.
Probably want to start with me.
Okay.
Let's have that discussion.
I thought you and I had that discussion and that you understood the issues. So maybe I'm confused here. That's why I was surprised to see that there's still this controversy. Well,
the question is, so what would you recommend? I mean, DNSSEC is implemented, and the slowing down the validation side, the checking side, isn't going to change that situation. So you'd have to argue, I think, that you want to roll back the deployment of DNSSEC on the signing side. That's a tall order.
Well, I wasn't asserting a rollback. I was merely asserting that one of the barriers to adoption on the signing side is this amplification of DDoS attacks, that making DDoS attacks much more effective, and that if we continue to close our eyes to that as a problem, we'll be berating people who have very legitimate reasons why they haven't yet implemented.
Yes, I hear you, but so this is where we have to be kind of careful and delicate. The issue on the table is on the checking side.
Okay, my confusion there then. Okay.
Yeah, on the signing side, there's already a substantial amount of deployment, and I don't think there's any leverage in. I mean, even if you say no more signing. There's plenty of signing that's already been done that will be that's more than enough to run the kind of amplified DDoS attacks that people seem to be concerned about. So, if we say give full weight to DNSSEC is bad because it makes amplified DDoS attacks possible. That's already happened. And,
so we're making no recommendation about people increasing the amount of signing. We're simply making recommendations about resolvers.
Yes, that's the scope of the working group. That's the scope of the assignment from, the structure of this working group within the auspices of CSRIC and FCC focused on ISPs. We're now in sort of a high-level structure problem. It's completely, and I apologize if I'm getting this wrong, but I believe it's completely outside the scope of FCC and CSRIC to comment or to give any suggestions about the signing side of things, because that's a whole different community of operations that, okay. You understand what I'm saying?
My error. I mixed the two up. I shouldn't make that mistake.
Yeah.
I did have a second question about split horizon DNS. And are there concerns about the safety of enterprises that operate split horizon DNS and safely having multiple DS records, since they'll have duplicate zones with different data inside them?
So that's a very interesting question. I'll tell you frankly that I have not heard anything along that line. It has occurred to me privately, and I haven't had any discussions, that I haven't worked through or been exposed to the details of DNSSEC implementation in a split horizon situation. I don't believe that there's anything particularly problematic. You simply sign the records that are visible in both directions. But it has crossed my mind that I haven't seen enough worked examples of split horizon with DNSSEC.
We think you run into interesting cases, certainly in the transition as you begin signing, possibly one and then the other, and if you have distinctions between the two. And certainly if you have subzones with different keys, you might run into weird cases for clients that can move between horizons.
I would imagine so.
So we think there should be some analysis there for folks that might be worth commenting on in the future.
I agree with you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for entertaining my rambling.
You were entertaining me.
Any other questions?
Comments?
Comments?
Well, I thank you, and I'll be happy to remain available for whatever you wish.
Thank you, Steve. With that, we'll entertain the vote for adopting the report for DNSSEC by Working Group 5. All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. All right, report passes, adopted unanimously. And thank you again, Steve. Working Group 1 has reported on all of their deliverables, but I do want to provide Laurie and Brian an opportunity to provide a status update if they would like to. Laurie or Brian, would you like to?
This is Lori Flaherty. Thank you. We obviously don't really have anything to report, but would again like to thank the members of our group for all the work that they did.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie and Brian. All right, that concludes our reports, the adoption of the reports. In closing, I'd just like to say that I want to thank Chairman Janikowski and the commissioners for the opportunity to chair CSRIC 3. It's truly been my honor and pleasure to serve in this distinguished role and to be involved with so many smart and committed people. I've sincerely enjoyed working with Jamie Barnett and David Turetsky, and of course Jeff and Lauren, and each of the council members. the group leaders, and really everyone involved here. I want to especially thank Stacy Hartman for taking really the difficulty out of my job here. The recommendations and reports that were developed by this council have already begun to influence critical communication industry decisions that will enhance the security of our nation's networks for years to come. And I believe that every council member, each commission staff person helping lead this effort, every support person involved can be proud of the work and the accomplishments of this council. I look forward to continued dialogue with the Commission and the communications industry on issues that will further enhance the security and reliability of the nation's communication systems, and I expect to continue to support the work of this council. So thank you all for all you've accomplished as part of the CSRIC 3 Council. Again, thank you for your support as I've chaired this council. And it's been a pleasure to do that. So thank you. And Jeff, I'll turn the meeting back over to you for adjournment.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. And likewise, it's been a pleasure working with you and with Stacy. You're all probably very tired by now. Thank you, and have a safe trip home.